Tonight, I want to tell you about a question that sits at the very heart of the Star Wars universe, though it is rarely asked aloud. Which worlds could you actually survive on, and which ones would kill you in a day? The galaxy, as it turns out, is not equally hospitable. Some planets are paradises, lush, temperate, forgiving places where breathable air hangs thick, water runs abundant, and a person could, in theory, wake up tomorrow and simply walk outside without elaborate preparation. Others are death traps of such absolute hostility that even stepping out of a ship onto their surface is, for an unprotected human, a countdown clock to extinction. And it is that contrast, that stark divide between the survivable and the lethal, that I find myself thinking about a great deal. There is something deeply human in it, I think. We are creatures adapted to a very specific kind of world, with very specific tolerances and needs. We need air we can breathe, water we can drink, temperatures that will not immediately cook the flesh from our bones or freeze the blood in our veins. We need these things not as luxuries, but as the absolute minimum conditions of existence. The Star Wars galaxy spans hundreds of thousands of worlds, from the gleaming ecumenopolies of Coruscant, where entire continents have been paved over into a single vast city, to planets so hostile that only the most specialized life forms, or the most desperate beings, would dare to call them home. And what I want to explore with you over the time we have together is where the line actually falls. Which worlds are the ones where humanity thrives, where you could build a life, raise a family, exist with relative comfort and safety? And which are the ones where every system in your body is screaming that you do not belong here, that this place was not made for you, that you are living on borrowed time? The thing that strikes me most about this question, when I sit with it, is how much it matters. In the saga we know, the choice of which world to flee to, which world to hide on, which world to make your stand on, these are not small decisions. They shape wars. They determine who lives and who dies. When the Rebel Alliance needed a base of operations, they chose Hoth, an ice planet so brutally cold that the native predators, the Wampers, are among the most dangerous creatures the galaxy has ever produced. This was not a choice made from comfort or convenience. This was survival by way of isolation, by choosing a world so hostile that the Empire would struggle to project power there. The cost of that choice was paid in blood and frost, and the lives of soldiers who had to adapt themselves to an environment that wanted nothing more than to kill them. Similarly, when the Separatists needed to manufacture a clone army in secret, they turned to Kamino, an ocean world of endless storms where the Kaminoans, a species of tall, elegant beings uniquely adapted to that environment, could work in isolation, hidden beneath perpetual clouds. The clones were born in tanks on a world where no other power could easily reach them. And when the war finally came, it came first to this rain-soaked world, to a facility that was built on the implicit assumption that distance and weather would protect it. It did not. There is a pattern here, though, and I want to lay it out before we begin in earnest. The galaxy does seem to operate according to certain principles when it comes to habitability. Worlds that are survivable tend to share characteristics: a breathable atmosphere, or one that only requires moderate protection, water in abundance, moderate temperatures, or at least temperatures that cycle in ways that allow for shelter and adaptation, and native ecosystems that, while they may be dangerous, have evolved over millennia to coexist with other forms of life. Naboo is, perhaps, the closest thing to a paradise world in the known galaxy. It has all of these things and more: grasslands rolling beneath open sky, swamps thick with life, oceans deep and navigable, and a climate that is genuinely pleasant by most standards. Humans and Gungans, a species as alien to each other as it is possible to imagine, have both built civilizations there, and the planet sustains them. Tatooine, by contrast, is a desert, brutal and unforgiving, orbiting twin suns that beat down on sand and stone with relentless heat. And yet people live there, have lived there for generations, adapted themselves to the scarcity of water, the heat, the isolation, the sense that the planet itself is actively trying to reduce your circumstances. It is survivable because the atmosphere is breathable, and with knowledge and preparation, and usually a good deal of luck, you can coax existence out of it. Now consider Mustafar. Mustafar is a world where lava rivers flow in place of water, where the ground itself is molten, where the very air is thick with toxic gases and heat that would cook a human being in moments if they stepped out of their ship unprotected. There is no adaptation to this. There is no way to live on Mustafar as a human without technology to sustain you, without constant life support, without everything filtering and cooling and managing the environment between you and immediate death. It is beautiful, I think. There is something almost hypnotic in the footage we have of those lava flows, the orange and red light reflecting off distant stone. But it is beautiful in the way a furnace is beautiful, in the way a fire is beautiful. You can admire it from a distance, but you cannot dwell in it. The same is true of Hoth, though in precisely the opposite way. Hoth is not a world on fire, but a world of ice, where the cold is so profound and so constant that exposed flesh begins to suffer damage within minutes. The Tauntauns, the creatures the rebels used as mounts, are native to that world, adapted to it over millennia, but they are also exhausted by it, their bodies constantly burning energy just to maintain warmth, just to continue existing. A human being on Hoth without shelter, without warmth, without constant active protection against that cold, will die quickly. And then there are the worlds that are hostile in ways that are, perhaps, even more primal. Genosis is a desert world, yes, but it is not merely a desert. It is the home of the Genosians, an insectoid species with a civilization built on violence and hierarchy, a world where the very landscape is shaped by their hive tunnels and their presence, where an outsider is not merely uncomfortable, but actively unwelcome, where survival means not just fighting the planet, but fighting the people. There are other worlds beyond these, worlds that are stranger, more dangerous, more alien in their hostility. Exegol, shrouded in permanent darkness and storms, a world so hidden and so wrong that it feels almost unnatural. And Mortis, which is not quite a normal world at all, but something else entirely, a place where the rules themselves seem different, where the force itself is strange and overwhelming. But before we go to those places, before we dive into the truly lethal worlds, I think it is worth understanding first what the survivable ones teach us, how they work, what it means to exist on them. And then, slowly, we will turn our gaze toward the worlds where survival is not a default state, but a desperate, fragile miracle. So come with me now, and let us begin with the question itself. Let us understand what makes a world habitable and what it costs to call it home. Before we venture into any world at all, I think we need to sit with what it means, in the most practical sense, for a planet to be survivable. Because survivability is not a feeling or a preference. It is a mathematical fact, a series of hard boundaries between life and unraveling. At its root, survival is a negotiation between a body and an environment, and there are only so many ways that negotiation can succeed. The first and most obvious of those ways is the air itself. In the Republic's scientific frameworks, the ones they have refined over 10,000 years of mapping and settling and losing worlds, planets are classified by their atmospheres into 4 types. A Type I atmosphere is the Holy Grail, breathable for humans and most humanoid species without any aid, without any mask or filter or apparatus between your lungs and the sky. You can step out of your ship and simply breathe, and your body will know it as home. There is something almost sacred about that simplicity. A Type II atmosphere is still breathable, but only barely. Your lungs can draw oxygen from it, but there is something in the composition, perhaps a trace of sulfur or a density that makes it heavy, that over hours or days will begin to tax your system. A breath mask for extended work, or a rebreather simple enough to fit in your pocket, and you can manage. but you cannot forget it is there. Type III atmospheres are the frontier where ordinary breathing ends. You need equipment, a proper respirator or environment suit, the kind of gear that marks you as someone stepping into a world not designed for you. And Type IV is the absolute boundary, toxic enough to burn your lungs in a single breath, or vacuum itself, or an atmosphere so alien that every moment without a sealed suit is a countdown to unconsciousness. There is no negotiation there. But atmosphere alone does not make a world livable, and I think that's the first insight worth sitting with. The second requirement is water. Water is not merely comfort, it is the irreplaceable engine of biological life as we understand it. Every cell in your body is mostly water, and when water leaves you faster than it can be replaced, you become progressively less yourself, until the point where there is simply nothing left to revive. A human can survive weeks without food, but only days without water and in a harsh environment, a desert under twin suns, for instance. The timeline compresses to something closer to ours. Which is why Tatooine, that isolated desert world orbiting its two suns, Tatooine and Tatoo-II, produces a technology that tells you everything about what it means to live on the margins. The moisture vaporator. These are simple devices, ingenious in their way, that extract water from the air itself, pulling vapor from an atmosphere so dry that most worlds would give up entirely. A farmer on Tatooine might harvest a few liters a day from a vaporator array, enough to sustain a family if supplemented by careful rationing, and crops bred to survive on minimal water. To live on Tatooine is to measure your life in units of moisture, to understand that every drop is survival itself, and that to lose your vaporators is to be slowly, methodically dying from the inside. There is a clarity to that kind of existence. The third requirement is shelter, and this is where survival becomes not merely biological, but existential. On the ice planet Hoth, the nighttime temperature drops so far below freezing that exposed skin will lose all sensation in minutes, and death arrives quietly in the form of hypothermia as your body's core temperature collapses. But the rebellion's soldiers survived there because they had shields, enclosed structures, heating systems, and the tactical wisdom to understand that you do not venture into the night without armor and companionship. There is a story from the early rebellion, when an officer named Han Solo was stranded on Hoth with a young Force-sensitive named Luke Skywalker, and the cold came down so hard and fast that they were going to die if they did not find immediate shelter. Han, who had survived countless desperate situations by living on instinct and improvisation, made the terrible choice. He took a tauntaun, a large, warm-blooded creature native to Hoth, and he cut it open, and he placed Luke inside its body cavity, using the creature's fading body heat to prevent Luke from freezing to death during the night. It is not a choice anyone would make gladly, but it works, and it tells you something true about survival. When the margin between life and death becomes that narrow, you do what the moment requires. The fourth requirement is harder to name, but perhaps the most crucial. A biosphere in balance, other life already thriving in an environment, suggesting that your own life, adapted or prepared correctly, might thrive as well. A world where nothing lives is a world sending you a message. When the rebellion scouts found Dagobah, they discovered a swamp, a murky, uninviting place, thick with fog and standing water, and the sounds of creatures moving beneath the surface. But Dagobah had atmosphere, had water in abundance, and had a biosphere so ancient and established that one of the Jedi Order's wisest teachers, a being named Yoda, had lived there in exile for centuries without any technology, without any apparatus, simply existing in balance with a world that most would have called hostile and unpleasant. Because hostile and uninviting do not mean lethal, they mean difficult, and difficulty is navigable if the fundamental conditions are met. This is perhaps the deepest distinction we need to hold in mind as we move forward. There is a difference between a world that is hard to live on and a world that is impossible to live on. A world that is hard demands preparation, intelligence, adaptation, and often the sacrifice of comfort. A world that is impossible does not negotiate. Consider the difference between Camino and Mustafar. Camino is an ocean world, drowning in constant, torrential storms, where rain falls in sheets and visibility is measured in meters, and the very ground beneath you is water. But the Kaminoans, an aquatic species with biological adaptation to that environment, built cities on stilts rising above the surface, structures like Topoka City that float on the endless ocean and bring air and light and shelter to those inside. It is hard, yes, and lonely in a particular way, but it is possible. Mustafar, by contrast, is a volcanic hellscape where rivers of lava flow like water, where the ground itself is actively hostile to biological life, where the atmosphere is thick with caustic compounds and ash. The temperatures are such that human flesh would begin to char and blacken within seconds of exposure. There is no adaptation that solves this without technology capable of sealing you completely away from the world around you. And finally, there is the matter of margins and degrees. The gas giant Bespin has a lethal surface thousands of kilometers below its cloud layer, where pressure and temperature become inconceivable. But at a specific altitude, in a specific layer of atmosphere, there exists a band of space where conditions are breathable, temperatures are moderate, and life is possible. Humans built Cloud City there, a floating structure suspended in that sweet spot between paradise above and oblivion below, dependent entirely on the technology keeping them aloft and the knowledge that a single system failure means falling into conditions that would destroy them. To survive on Bespin is to survive on borrowed time and borrowed atmosphere, a temporary arrangement you maintain through constant vigilance. And I think that's the frame we need to carry with us as we move forward. Survivability is not a matter of good luck or preference. It is a precise calculation of atmosphere, water, shelter, biosphere, and the degree to which your specific biology matches the world's requirements. Some worlds gift you all of these things without asking for much in return. Others demand everything you have and may still refuse to let you live. The gap between those two states is the story we are about to tell. If you wanted to understand why some planets become centers of power and others remain forgotten outposts, Naboo is the place to begin. Not because it is unique, but because it is almost superlatively itself, a planet that seems to have been designed by something with a very clear idea of what a world ought to be. It sits in the Chomel sector of the mid-rim, and when you approach it from space, the first thing that strikes you is the color, not the gray and brown of most worlds, but something that announces itself immediately as verdant, as alive, as fundamentally hospitable to the kind of life we recognize. The atmosphere is breathable without assistance, type I, entirely compatible with unaugmented human respiration, and beneath it lies a carefully balanced geography that the second chapter's framework would recognize immediately as nearly ideal. There are rolling green hills, grassy plains that stretch for vast distances, forests thick enough to provide shelter and resources, swamps that support their own distinct ecosystems, and an abundance of water in the form of lakes, rivers, and the remarkable underground passages that connect the planet's hidden depth. The climate is temperate, consistent, and moderate. You will not find yourself in the grip of either extreme cold or overwhelming heat, and the seasons, when they come, shift gently rather than catastrophically. What makes Naboo genuinely remarkable is that two entirely different sapient civilizations evolved to share it, or came to share it, and both found the conditions workable enough to build sophisticated societies without competing directly for the same territory. The human Naboo descended from settlers who arrived from a distant planet called Grismalt, carrying with them the architectural traditions and cultural refinement of an older, more developed world, established their primary settlement in the city of Theed, built on a high plateau beside the Solu River, overlooking waterfalls and surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that no amount of construction can diminish. These is an expression of what the Naboo valued: art, craft, classical elegance, the kinds of things a civilization creates when its basic survival is not in question, when you have enough security and resources to ask yourself what beauty ought to look like. The royal palace stands at the city's heart, seat of government and residence of the elected monarch, because Naboo's governance system reflects something of that same philosophy: the belief that power ought to be held lightly, by those chosen for their wisdom rather than their birthright, and that those chosen ought to serve defined terms rather than reign indefinitely. It is a striking contrast to much of the galaxy, and it is only possible because the planet itself provides enough to work with. The Gungans, the native amphibious species, built their civilization entirely beneath the surface, in cities of extraordinary sophistication, principal among them Otoh Gunga, which lies in the depths of Lake Paunga and is constructed entirely from hydrostatic bubble domes, engineered structures that maintain livable pressure and atmosphere by manipulating water pressure itself. They navigate their world through submarine vessels called bongos, traveling the underwater passages that thread through Naboo's honeycombed interior, a network of caves and tunnels that hints at something unusual about the planet's geology. Naboo has no molten core in the traditional sense. Instead, it is riddled through with porous channels and caverns, and at its center lies not a boiling mass of metal, but something far stranger. A plasma core, an energy source so profound and accessible that the human Naboo have built entire refinery complexes in need specifically to harvest and refine it, making it one of the planet's chief exports, and suggesting that Naboo's advantages are not merely geographic but energetic, something written into the planet's fundamental nature. What is worth sitting with is how completely survivable this all is, how little would need to go wrong for someone to establish themselves here permanently and reasonably comfortably. A person arriving on Naboo with nothing would immediately find water, breathable air, and potential shelter. The forests suggest edible plants. The plains suggest herbivorous animals suitable for domestication or hunting. The temperature suggests you would not need to construct shelter immediately to avoid freezing or heat death. This is the baseline of habitability, the standard against which lethal worlds will eventually be measured. The Naboo themselves understood this well enough that they built a civilization predicated on peace rather than militarism, on art rather than preparation for war, on the assumption that their world would continue to provide as it had provided. Their security forces were small, their standing army almost non-existent, their pilots few enough that Bravo Squadron, a handful of N1 starfighters, sleek and beautiful in chrome and yellow, represented a significant portion of their defense capability. They had no need for massive garrisons or industrial military infrastructure because, for most of their history, Naboo's greatest defense was what the framework established in the last chapter: the fact that it was simply not hostile, that the planet itself would support you rather than oppose you. When conflict came, as it eventually did during the Trade Federation invasion in 32 BBY, the Naboo discovered rather abruptly that a hospitable world does not defend itself, that abundance and peace are not the same thing as safety, and that other beings in the galaxy might value what Naboo possessed. But even that invasion, for all its trauma and violation, did not render the planet uninhabitable. It remained what it had always been, a world that offered life to those who reached its surface. The human rulers of Naboo were themselves often young when they assumed the throne. Padme Nabari Amidala was elected queen at only 14 years of age, taking the regnal name Amidala, an age at which most beings in the galaxy would be considered barely more than children, yet one that Naboo's system trusted to contain wisdom. She was surrounded by advisors: the governor Sio Bibble, the security chief Captain Panaka, and the royal handmaidens who served both ceremonial and protective functions. But the fact that such youth could be entrusted with leadership speaks to something about how stable, how secure, how fundamentally functional Naboo's world was. Later, as senator for the Chomel sector, Amidala would represent her world not as a military power, but as a voice for peace, a diplomatic presence, which itself reflects what Naboo was. A world that had learned how to survive not through strength, but through cooperation and cultivation. When you stand back from the details, the plasma cores and the hydrostatic domes and the names of monarchs, what remains is the understanding that Naboo is what habitability looks like when it is not being tested to its limits, when a world simply works, when two different species can share a planet because there is genuinely enough for both. It is the blueprint for survival, not because it is extreme or challenging, but because it is fundamentally, almost generously, possible. The Gungan cities and the human settlements, the forests and the plains and the underwater caverns, the rivers and the plasma and the temperate seasons, all of it together composes a kind of living answer to the question posed at the beginning. Yes, beings can survive here, not merely survive but thrive, build civilizations, create beauty, and think about something other than the immediate question of whether they will eat or freeze tomorrow. This is what we meant in the framework when we spoke of the baseline of habitability. Naboo is that baseline, made tangible and specific and real. It is a world where, if you arrived tomorrow with nothing, you would have every reasonable expectation of still being alive a year from now. There is something almost peaceful in that certainty. If Naboo is the answer to the question of what a world needs to sustain life, then Tatooine is the question itself. What happens when nearly everything is taken away? It is a desert planet orbiting twin suns, Tatooine and Tatoo-II, so far from the major trade routes of the galaxy that it might as well exist in another universe entirely. The Outer Rim territories are the frontier, the places the Republic's attention does not quite reach, and within that vast outback, Tatooine sits in the Arcanis sector like something half forgotten. When the suns rise, both of them, because they always rise together and set together, painting the sky in gradients of amber and violet in ways Naboo's single sun never could. They do not rise on a merciful world. The dune sea stretches to every horizon, massive and impassive, and the temperature climbs until the sand itself seems to shimmer with a kind of malevolent heat. There are the Jundland wastes too, badlands of rock and canyon that offer neither the openness of the dunes nor the promise of shelter, just miles of jagged terrain where the sun finds you no matter where you hide. And then night comes, and the temperature drops with the sudden, vicious efficiency of a predator's strike, plummeting toward cold that can kill as readily as the heat. There is almost no water on Tatooine. This is the foundational fact from which everything else follows. Not the absence of water, which implies it existed once and is gone, but scarcity so profound that water has become something closer to currency than to a natural resource. The people who came to Tatooine, and they came because the Outer Rim was open, because nowhere else would have them, because they were seeking something and Tatooine was far enough away that they might find it without being followed, learned very quickly that they could not farm in the traditional sense. The soil would not cooperate, the rain would not come, the seasons would not turn in ways that favored crops. Instead, they learned to coax moisture from the air itself, using vaporators, machines that hang from structures above the desert and draw the faintest traces of water vapor from even the driest air. It is a brilliant solution, really, elegant in the way that only desperation can make a solution elegant. And it allows people to survive on Tatooine who should by every law of planetary habitability have no right to be there at all. These moisture farmers live in homesteads scattered across the desert, and they live mostly underground, burrowed into the earth where the temperature is stable and the sun cannot reach them. You come out of the ground in the early morning when the heat is merely extreme rather than lethal, and you tend your vaporators, and you watch the sky, and you hope that today will be the day the moisture pulls down enough to fill your cisterns. It is not a life of abundance. It is not even a life of genuine comfort. It is the life of someone making a choice, usually not freely, to extract survival from a world that does not want to give it. But Tatooine was already inhabited when the settlers came, and this is where the story becomes richer and stranger. The Jawas are small creatures, rodent-like and wrapped always in brown robes with only their glowing eyes visible, and they are native to Tatooine in the way that the desert itself is native. They speak Jawese, a rapid, clicking language that sounds like the utterance of insects, and they are scavengers, not in the sense of feeding on carrion, but in the sense that they move through the desert, collecting everything it has broken or abandoned. They travel in massive treaded vehicles called sandcrawlers, which are the size of buildings and are themselves salvaged from an earlier age, mining transports left behind by settlers who came before and then gave up or died. The sandcrawler is home and warehouse and mobile empire, and the Jawas trade in droids and scrap metal and the detritus of 1,000 failed attempts to make something of this planet. There is something moving about them, I think, not in a sentimental way, but in the quiet recognition that they have adapted to Tatooine so completely that they do not seem to be suffering under it the way an outsider would. The Tuskens, though, the Sand People or Tusken Raiders, as they are known to the settlers, are something else entirely. They are native to Tatooine in the deepest sense. They did not come here seeking something. They did not colonize or settle or decide to make a life here. They simply were always here, and Tatooine made them what they are. Every inch of their bodies is wrapped in cloth and bandages, and they wear breathing apparatus and goggles because their physiology has evolved or adapted such that the bare desert air itself is hostile to them without protection. They ride banthas, enormous shaggy-horned herd animals that move across the dunes with a rolling, patient gait, and they move single file across the desert so that from a distance, a raiding party looks like one creature rather than many, hiding their numbers as they move through land they have inhabited longer than anyone. The Krayt dragon dwells in the deepest deserts, a predator so large that it has become almost mythological, though the threat of it is perfectly real. The dewback and the womp rat and 100 other creatures native to or adapted to Tatooine speak to a simple truth. Life finds a way, even in places where life should not reasonably exist. But the settlements, Mos Eisley, Mos Espa, Anchorhead, these are different. They are places where desperation pooled and became permanent, where people decided that survival here was preferable to whatever they were running from. The spaceports are hubs of smuggling and trade, places where the law is something negotiable and criminal organizations, notably the Hutts, hold authority more complete and more visible than any government. This is what Tatooine is, a world that is survivable but only barely, only with constant effort, only if you are willing to compromise comfort for breathing, to live half underground, to never take water for granted, to understand that every day is a negotiation with the planet itself. And the people who stay, whether they are moisture farmers standing in the pre-dawn cool, or Jawas cataloging salvage in their crawlers, or Tuskens riding across dunes that have been theirs since before anyone had a word for settlement, they have all accepted a simple truth. Tatooine will give you life, but it will never give you ease. It is a world that teaches you something about the difference between living and existing, and for some people, for some reason, that is enough. Imagine a world so tall that the sky itself seems like a distant memory, where the horizon is not a line, but a ceiling of green that reaches up into clouds you'll never see from the ground. This is Kashyyyk, a forest planet in the mid-rim, near the end of a great hyperspace route called the Corellian Run, and it is a world that learned to survive not by adapting to the land, but by leaving it behind. The Rosha trees that dominate Kashyyyk are not merely tall, they are impossibly, almost inconceivably tall, some of them stretching hundreds of meters into the sky, interwoven with one another until they form a continuous canopy so dense that sunlight becomes a rumor rather than a presence. Walking on the surface of Kashyyyk, if you were foolish enough to try, would be like walking on the ocean floor in a place where the water never stops moving and never stops trying to kill you. The lower levels of the forest, what the natives call the Shadowlands, a home to creatures that hunt in the darkness. The Catan, the Kinrath, things with too many legs and not enough mercy, all competing in an ecosystem so hostile that the forest floor itself seems designed to refuse life. There are giant spiders called Waiascox and webweavers that spin traps across the spaces between the trees, and the forest is so thick with danger that even the air feels sharp with threat. But the Wookiees, the tall, strong, hirsute people who have called Kashyyyk home for longer than anyone can quite remember, understood something essential. If the ground was deadly, then they would not live on the ground. Instead, they built their cities in the sky, not suspended by artificial means, but cradled in the rosha trees themselves, nested in the high branches and the vast interconnected canopies where the air was clearer and the predators below were only a rumor. Cachurho and Awakroro became tree cities, places where an entire civilization grew in the vertical spaces, where the architecture and the forest were one continuous thing. To be a Wookiee on Kashyyyk was to be a creature of height and depth, to understand instinctively that safety lay above and danger lay below. A young Wookiee would grow up hearing the roars and growls of Shari'Ewok, the language of their people, a tongue of force and fury that most aliens from other worlds found nearly impossible to speak, learning that their language itself was shaped by living among the vast silences of the canopy. Their hands were strong enough to weave and build, skilled enough to craft bowcasters, weapons that were part crossbow, part engineering marvel, firing bolts with deadly precision, and patient enough to shape wood and metal into the intricate mechanisms of a civilization that had learned to thrive in the heights. But there was something else in Wookiee culture that made them truly remarkable, and that was their sense of loyalty, of honor, of a concept they called a life debt. If a Wookiee owed you their life, if you had saved them or stood with them when the world around you was trying to kill you both, then that debt was binding, absolute, something that would endure across lifetimes and outlast empires. They lived extraordinarily long lives, Wookiees, many of them surviving 100 years or more, some reaching towards centuries, which meant that the bonds they formed were not fragile things, not promises made and forgotten, but deep commitments that shaped the course of their existence. A Wookiee on Kashyyyk was someone grounded, if that word could even apply to creatures who spent their entire lives in the heights, in a culture that understood loyalty as something more fundamental than instinct, more permanent than flesh. The rite of passage for a young Wookiee involved descending into the lower levels of the forest, down into the darkness where the predators hunted and the forest itself tried to kill you, a journey that stripped away everything except the core of who you were and what you were capable of surviving. It was a way of saying, this is the darkness we refuse to live in, and by confronting it, you prove you belong in the light above. For centuries, for thousands of years, perhaps, Kashyyyk existed this way, a world where a species had found not perfect safety, but a kind of earned peace, where adaptation meant moving upward, where the constant danger below made the homes they had built in the branches feel like genuine sanctuary. But peace, as it so often does in our story, did not endure. During the Clone Wars, in the final days of the Republic, a separatist droid army launched an assault on Kashyyyk as part of the Outer Rim sieges, and the Wookiees found themselves fighting to defend not just their homes, but their survival as a species. Jedi Master Yoda, an ancient being who had seen centuries of galactic history unfold, traveled to Kashyyyk to fight alongside them, standing against waves of droids in the thick forests where the trees themselves became walls and shields. It was in those forests, during that battle, that Order 66 came down, the terrible command that would turn every Jedi's clone troopers against them, that would signal the rise of the Empire and the fall of the Republic in a single, catastrophic moment. Yoda survived only because of the Wookiees, because Tarful, a Wookiee chieftain of great strength and honor, and Chewbacca, a young Wookiee who would go on to become perhaps the most famous of his kind, helped him escape, preserving his life and honoring the bonds of loyalty that their culture held sacred. And then the Empire came, and it was as though Kashyyyk's greatest vulnerability, that it was isolated, that it was rich in resources, that the galaxy paid it little attention, became a cause for punishment rather than mercy. Emperor Palpatine harbored a particular hatred for Wookiees, a prejudice that would become the engine of their suffering. The Wookiees were enslaved in vast numbers, their tremendous strength put to work in construction and mining operations across the galaxy, their homes stripped from them, their freedom taken, their culture fragmented and scattered across worlds they had never asked to see. The beings who had learned to live in the heights were forced into darkness, into the mines and the factories, into the kind of captivity that strips away everything except endurance. I think about Kashyyyk often when I consider what makes a world survivable, because it presents a truth that pure habitability does not account for. A world is only truly safe if you are allowed to live in it. The Rosha forests would have sustained the Wookiees indefinitely, would have provided everything they needed to thrive, would have been a paradise by any standard we could measure. But all of that became irrelevant the moment another power decided they did not belong there anymore. The forests remained beautiful and deadly and tall. The canopies still offered refuge from the Shadowlands below. But home, true home, became something a Wookiee could only remember, not inhabit. Kashyyyk teaches us that survival is not only a question of what a planet offers, but of who gets to claim it. Before we talk about the worlds that will kill you, I want to linger for a moment on one that was almost too beautiful to belong to the same galaxy as everywhere else. Alderaan was a terrestrial world in the core, which is to say it was close to the heart of things, orbited by 2 moons, blessed with a climate that seemed almost curated by some benevolent hand. It had snow-capped mountains, yes, and vast grasslands that rolled without end, and oceans, deep, clear oceans where the water was clean enough to be called noble. The capital, Alderaan, was built on an island in the middle of a caldera lake, so that the city itself seemed to float at the intersection of water and sky. It is worth knowing this detail, because it tells you something about how the people of Alderaan chose to live. They built their center in a place surrounded by beauty, vulnerable, exposed, with nowhere to hide. Unlike Naboo, which had hidden cities and domed settlements in case things went wrong, Alderaan put its greatest treasures in plain sight, and trusted that sight itself would be enough to keep them safe. The whole planet was like that, actually. Its surface was largely free of heavy industry, the kind of sprawling factories and refineries and mines that scar other worlds and turn the soil grey. The inhabitants of Alderaan, they were almost entirely human, a culture unified rather than divided by that, had made a deliberate choice, generations back, to prize harmony with nature. They were not trying to dominate their world or extract everything from it. They were trying to live in it. That's a fundamentally different approach, and it shows in the landscape itself. The planet was ruled by the House of Organa, a royal family whose monarchs held the title of Viceroy and First Chairman. If that sounds like it's trying to sound both regal and democratic at once, that's because it was. Alderaan understood itself as a monarchy, but one that did not believe in unchecked power, and that too is woven into the character of the place. Bail Prester Organa was the viceroy during the years we're concerned with, the Clone Wars and after, a man of the Republic Senate, and something harder to define than that. A man of principle in a moment when principle was going out of fashion. His wife was Queen Breha, and together they held the line of Alderaan's commitment to something the rest of the galaxy was rapidly forgetting how to do. They believed in peace. Not the absence of conflict, the way a defeated people believe in it, the peace that comes from having no more will to fight. But peace as an active, chosen principle. Alderaan was known, across the core and beyond, as a world without weapons. There is a story, told as fact in some places and as legend in others, that the Alderaanians had taken their weapons, the ones they had, when they made this choice, and launched them into their sun. A symbolic act, possibly, or possibly literal. The sources differ, and perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that the commitment was real enough to be famous. A world without weapons, in a galaxy that seemed to be learning, year by year, to speak in no other language. In 19 BBY, not long after the end of the Clone Wars, Bail and Breha Organa brought a small child to their home on that peaceful planet. The child's birth name was Leia Amidala Skywalker, and her story is not ours to tell fully here, but know this. She was born on a world of grief and hidden danger, and she came to Alderaan to be raised in safety. She became Princess Leia Organa, and in time she too would become a senator, and something the Empire would come to fear very much. But in the years between her childhood and that fear, she grew up in a place where mountains were just mountains, where water was just water, where it was possible to believe that beauty was enough, that the right words might move hearts, that a planet preserved in peace could preserve the people on it. You can see why the Empire would find such a world intolerable. It existed as a kind of argument against everything Palpatine was building, everything the Death Star represented. And perhaps that is why in 0 BBY, when Tarkin stood aboard that terrible machine and looked for a world to obliterate, not out of military necessity, but as a demonstration of power, a way of saying, "Look what we can do, bow before us." Perhaps that is why he chose Alderaan. Princess Leia was aboard his ship by then, a prisoner, and he asked her where the rebel base was hidden, and she gave him a false answer. Dantooine, a smaller, less protected world far to the outer rim. He told her he would destroy Dantooine instead, to make clear the cost of defiance. But then he changed his mind. He chose Alderaan instead. The Viceroy and the Queen were on that planet, you see. And perhaps Tarkin knew it, or perhaps he simply understood, the way a man who makes a career of power sometimes understands these things, that the most powerful demonstration would be to take the most beautiful world in the galaxy and unmake it. He aimed the Death Star superlaser at the planet that had no weapons, the world that believed in peace, the world that had taught a young princess that beauty and principle could survive. And he fired, and Alderaan ceased to exist. Not in the sense that it went dark, or changed, or diminished. It exploded. It became debris, billions of tons of it, an asteroid field where a planet had been, orbiting the coordinates where Alderaan used to be. Bail Organa died in that moment, and Breha Organa died in that moment, and every human, every Alderaanian who had chosen to live in those mountains and grasslands and on the shores of those clear oceans died in that moment. We have a record of it, in a way, because Obi-Wan Kenobi was aboard a ship en route to those coordinates when it happened. He was not a young man anymore, and he was not a Jedi anymore, not officially, not in any way the galaxy would recognize. But the Force was still in him, and through it, or because of it, he felt something in that instant, not a warning, not an instruction, but a kind of vast and terrible knowledge. He said that millions of voices cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. When the Millennium Falcon reached Alderaan's coordinates later, there was nothing there but debris and an Imperial presence, and the absolute fact that a world was gone. Some Alderaanians had survived, a handful, those who had been off-world when the Death Star fired, traders, explorers, students, the scattered few who happened to not be home that day. They became a diaspora, a people without a world, scattered across the galaxy like the debris of their planet, carrying in them the memory of beauty that could not survive. And I think about this when I think about habitability. Because Alderaan was habitable, more than habitable, it was ideal. It was a paradise in the way that Naboo was a paradise. It had everything a human being needed, and everything a human being might dream of. But it was not enough. The thing that killed Alderaan was not the lack of water, or a toxic atmosphere, or a diseased biosphere. It was power and cruelty, and the fact that in a galaxy at war, even the most beautiful world is not protected by its beauty. There's something in that distinction that I find myself returning to. What makes a world survivable is not just whether the air is breathable. It is whether there are other people willing to let you breathe it in peace. Endor, a name that technically belongs to a gas giant in the outer rim, is most famously known not for the planet itself, but for its forest moon, a place that should not work as well as it does. The moon orbits in a system far enough from the galactic core that the Empire thought it could hide there, that no one would think to look at a world so small, so remote, so utterly ordinary in its way. But what makes Endor remarkable is not its remoteness. It is that it is a world of apparent contradictions that somehow resolve into something surprisingly coherent, a place where the ancient and the technological coexist without quite consuming each other. The forest itself dominates almost everywhere you look. Enormous coniferous and deciduous trees rising to heights that make you understand why the word canopy was invented, their branches so thick and so densely layered that from above you would see almost nothing but green. The undergrowth is substantial, rich with flora that has learned to thrive in the dappled light beneath those towering crowns. And in that web of vegetation and wood, a staggering diversity of life has evolved. It is, to be honest, precisely the kind of place that should be difficult to survive on. Dense forests are rarely hospitable to outsiders, and yet the atmosphere is breathable, the climate temperate without being extreme, and the water is available. In other words, Endor works. The world's most prominent inhabitants are the Uoks, a species I find myself thinking about quite often, because they offer something we have not yet encountered in our journey through habitable worlds, a perfect and unforced equilibrium between their own development and the world they inhabit. The Uoks stand perhaps a meter tall, covered in fur, built compact and strong, and they have organized themselves into arboreal villages nestled among the forest giants. Bright Tree Village being the most well-known, though there are others scattered throughout the canopy. They do not have what you might call advanced technology in the way the Naboo do, or even the mechanical aptitude of the Tatooine scavengers. Their tools are wood and bone and stone, their weapons spears and bows and slings, their vehicles gliders that let them move among the high branches. And yet there is something profound about what this means. The Uoks have built a civilization that is perfectly scaled to their world, not because they lack the capacity for more, but because what they have is sufficient for everything they need. Chief Chirper leads Bright Tree Village, and his shaman Logray, recognizable by the skull he wears as a headdress, marked with symbols that speak of a spiritual understanding of the forest, serves as both spiritual guide and keeper of knowledge. There is a warrior class among the Uoks, beings like Paplu, and they maintain order and defend their territory. But there is no evidence that the Uoks are a particularly militaristic species, or that their existence is consumed by warfare in the way we saw on Kashyyyk, where the Wookiees had to retreat to the canopy to escape predators in the Shadowlands below. It is instead a world where a species has found not just survival, but something closer to contentment, where the technological capability to dominate the world has not become, as it so often does, a compulsion. The contradictions I mentioned become clear when you understand that Endor, 4 years before the pivotal events that would define it in galactic history, was not empty of other beings or other forms of organization. The Sannyasin Marauders, a humanoid species that had become marooned on the moon, lived on Endor in their own territories, a reminder that worlds rarely belong entirely to a single people. And the Yuzum, creatures of remarkable stature and intelligence, had carved out their own niche in the ecosystem, demonstrating once again that a habitable world, if it is genuinely habitable, often hosts multiple civilizations coexisting with greater or lesser degrees of harmony. There were predators here too. The Goraks, massive creatures that represented the kind of genuine danger that a habitable world can still contain, the reminder that habitability does not mean harmlessness. And then came the contradiction that truly defines Endor as a place of contradiction. The Empire's decision to place a shield generator bunker here, to hide the construction of the second Death Star in orbit above this small, forested, remote moon. The Empire chose Endor because it was hidden, because the vast forest would provide cover and concealment, because the coordinates of its hyperspace approach were not among the most traveled routes in the galaxy. They brought soldiers and walkers, the mechanical ATSD scout walkers that looked like the legalized nightmares of some weapons designer, and speeder bikes that carved paths through the forest at speeds the Uoks could barely comprehend. They carved out a clearing, built their fortification, strung their technology across a world that had, until that moment, had no need for any of it. What I find myself drawn to in this is that Endor before the occupation was precisely what we established in the previous chapter as the counter to the fate of Alderaan. A habitable world, breathing, alive, hosting multiple species in relative equilibrium, asking nothing of the galaxy and receiving, in turn, the relative gift of being left alone. The Uoks did not have weapons that could match the Empire's. They had spears and primitive explosives and an intimate knowledge of their own forest. The gap between what they possessed and what the Empire possessed was, by any reasonable measure, absolute. And yet in that gap, there is something else. Endor is a world that reveals, perhaps more clearly than any other in our journey, that habitability is not merely a matter of atmosphere and water and temperature. It is, in some deeper sense, about balance, between a civilization and its world, between what a species needs and what it takes, between being shaped by your environment and being allowed to shape it in turn. The Uoks represent a species that has achieved that balance or something very close to it, and Endor, moon of contradictions, hosting ancient forests and imperial bunkers, primitive villages and galactic military infrastructure, stands as a testament to what that balance looks like when it is genuine rather than aspirational. Let me come back to this world in the chapters ahead, when the contradictions will sharpen considerably, and when the true nature of that balance will become, in the end, less fragile than it first appears. For now, let us simply rest in the recognition that there exists at least one habitable world in this galaxy where the people who live there seem to have asked themselves not, what can we do to this world, but how can we live well within it? And that question, in all its quietness, is perhaps the most important one a civilization can ask. There is a particular kind of silence that descends on a desert world in the hours just after dawn, before the heat begins its full work, and Jakku holds that silence like a secret. It is a world that the galaxy forgot, or perhaps a world the galaxy used, and then discarded, the way one discards something that no longer holds value. Decades after the Empire fell at Endor, after the New Republic rose and tried to stitch the galaxy back together, the Battle of Jakku came to this remote corner of the Inner Rim, a final, grinding confrontation between the failing Empire and the ascending Republic, fought not for conquest, but for survival. And when the battle ended, when the last Star Destroyers came down from the sky and crashed into the sand, they left behind the largest graveyard a world could hold, warships stretching across the desert like the rib cages of colossal animals, half buried in dunes, their hulls rusting under twin suns that show no mercy to iron. You can understand, standing in the shadow of those wrecks, why people came. Salvage is a form of conversation with the past. You take what was built for war and violence, and you unmake it into something else, something smaller, something that might keep you alive. The atmosphere on Jakku is breathable, a fundamental mercy that Mustafar and Geonosis will later refuse, and that one fact opened the door to survival for the scavengers who came to pick the bones of those fallen ships. But the desert itself offers almost nothing else. Water, which we established as non-negotiable in the scientific foundation chapters, is here so scarce that it becomes not a resource, but a form of currency, traded in ration packets, measured in the small portions that mean the difference between continuing and stopping. A scavenger might work an entire day in the heat, climbing through the corroded corridors of a downed Star Destroyer, pulling free components worth salvage, only to trade what they found for a single meal's worth of portion bread and green instant food, expandable nutrients that bloat into something edible when mixed with water. You have to ration even that water. The Plutt family, through the junk boss Unkar Plutt, had engineered a monopoly so complete that it became the only grammar of survival on Jakku. You salvaged for Plutt, or you did not eat. It is a quieter kind of oppression than the Empire's boot on Kashyyyk, but it is oppression nonetheless, a different flavor of the same substance. The powerful controlling the terms on which the powerless are permitted to live. There was a young woman named Ray who embodied something of what Jakku demanded of its inhabitants. She lived alone in the hull of a toppled AT-AT Walker, a four-legged Imperial transport that had been brought down during the battle and now served as her shelter. One of the great fallen things converted into something livable, the same alchemy that drew salvagers to the graveyard in the first place. She had built her own speeder from scrap parts, pieced together through the kind of intuitive understanding of machinery that felt almost like memory, though she had no memory to speak of, no sense of where she had come from or why she was on Jakku at all. She wrapped her head and face against the sun and the abrasive sand, the way the native Tuscan raiders had learned to do on a planet with similar hostility, though she was human and they were something older, something the desert had made. Every day she woke and descended into the metal tombs of fallen starships, searching for components worth enough to trade, pushing against a system designed to ensure she would never accumulate enough to leave. There is something almost pure in that kind of survival, a stripping away of everything but the immediate calculus. Breathe, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The desert had no room for hope or ambition or the sense that one might deserve more, because the desert did not negotiate, and the Plutt monopoly had learned to think like the desert. But Jakku held other lives too, other ways of moving through scarcity. The Tido were small reptilian scavengers who rode lugebasts, pack animals cybernetically augmented, their bodies fitted with mechanical parts that made them part flesh and part apparatus, a survival strategy written into their own skin. The Night Watcher worms, vast and subterranean, moved through the sand hunting, and steelpeckers with metallic gizzards that drew magnetically to metal circled overhead, themselves adapted to feed on the abundance of salvage the battle had left behind. Even the introduced habitable, large draft beasts brought to the planet to serve the salvage economy, had become part of the ecosystem now, integrated into the hard machinery of survival. In Nirma Outpost, the ramshackle trading post named after an ancient Hutt who had once claimed the territory, commerce and scarcity had written a story of pure transaction. There was no softness here, no culture of art or philosophy the way Alderaan had cultivated those things before it was erased. There was only the relentless mathematics of what you had and what you could trade it for, the slow compression of human need into smaller and smaller portions. And yet people persisted, the way life persists in Tatooine's moisture farms and in the high canopies of Kashyyyk, where the Wookiees built their civilization in the spaces the Predators had left open. What Jakku teaches, standing here in the wreckage of the war that was supposed to end all wars, is that habitability is not merely a matter of atmosphere and water and shelter, though those things matter profoundly. It is also a matter of what the world permits, and what is permitted depends entirely on whether there is anyone strong enough to permit it. The Empire had fallen, but the logic of scarcity remained, and Unkar Plutt had learned to wield it the way the Empire had wielded a fleet. Ray, alone in her AT-AT shelter, embodied a kind of quiet heroism that the galaxy rarely saw fit to celebrate, the simple fact of continuing, day after day, in a place that offered nothing and asked everything. She had learned to want less, or to want differently, to see the wreckage of war as a kind of resource rather than a kind of defeat. She had built her own tools because there was no one else to build them, and she had survived because the alternative was unthinkable, and Jakku had long ago ceased offering alternatives of any kind. The twin suns climbed higher, and the heat began in earnest, and across the dunes and through the graveyards, Figures in wrappings and goggles began their descent into the metal tombs, searching for scraps worth surviving another day. Imagine a world where the sky is water, where the horizon curves not with clouds but with the weight of an endless ocean, and where civilization has learned not to resist that fact, but to build itself into it. Mon Cala, or Dak, as it was once known, is such a world, a planet in the outer rim territories whose surface is almost entirely submerged, where two intelligent species evolved not in competition, but in a kind of careful coexistence, each adapting to the depths available to them. The Mon calamari are the first you would notice. Amphibious beings with high-domed heads that seem shaped by the pressure of the waters around them, with large, luminous eyes that see clearly in dimness, and webbed hands built for precision work in currents where human fingers would be useless. The Quarren, sometimes called squid heads by those who have not learned to speak of them with respect, are their neighbors in these depths. Beings with squid-like faces ringed by 4 graceful facial tentacles, traditionally dwellers of the deeper waters, the trenches where sunlight does not reach and pressure would crush most carbon-based life. What is remarkable about Mon Cala is not that these two species exist there. It is that they exist there together, and that for most of galactic history they have. There was tension, certainly. There is always tension when two peoples occupy the same world, compete for the same resources, build their own visions of what the future should be. But the Mon calamari and Quarren built a unified government, a monarchy that represented both, a society that shared the oceans rather than divided them into hostile territories. This is a lesson that planets like Naboo understood as well, that survival is easier, richer, deeper when it is shared. The Mon calamari became renowned across the galaxy as shipbuilders, and there is a particular irony in this that I keep thinking about. A species whose entire world is ocean, whose every city floats or descends beneath the waves in domes and pressurized structures, who have learned to think in 3 dimensions because their home extends down as well as across. These people understand the mathematics of displacement, of hull integrity, of how to move through hostile medium without catastrophe. They built floating cities that were themselves works of art, structures of coral and engineered material that rose from the water and sank again as needed, cities that could be sealed against the pressure and the strange life of the depths, yet remain open to the currents and light when the sun reached them. But they also built starships. The Mon calamari star cruisers, the MC series, most famously the MC-80 cruisers, are among the finest warships ever constructed in the galaxy, not because Mon calamari are inherently warlike, but because they understand the physics of moving through a medium that resists you, of shielding what is fragile, of making something beautiful and functional at the same time. Admiral Jael Akbar is the name that echoes through galactic history, the Mon calamari who rose to command the Rebel Alliance fleet during the Galactic Civil War, who stood on the bridge of the flagship Home One at the Battle of Endor and saw a trap closing around them and spoke the words that have become something like a koan in this galaxy. It's a trap. But before Akbar became an admiral, before the rebellion had any ships at all, there was the Clone Wars, and on Mon Cala, those wars came with particular tragedy. King Yos Kalina, the Mon calamari monarch, was assassinated, and in the chaos that followed, the Quarren, or at least their leaders, a creature named Rift Tamsin, a Karkarodden from elsewhere with teeth and predatory grace, sided with the separatists. The civil war that erupted was not merely political. It was a sundering of the shared world, of the careful balance that had held. A young prince, Lichar, became king in his father's shadow, barely more than an adolescent, and the Republic sent aid. Clone troopers trained in aquatic warfare, their armor sealed and adapted, breathing through rebreathers, and a Jedi Master named Kit Fisto, a Nautolan whose own biology made him something akin to native in these waters. Captain Akbar served during these battles, defending the young king, and I think this matters to the shape of his character later, that he learned early that authority, even in the Jedi, arrives asking you to choose a side in a war that was not of your making. The Clone Wars ended, as they do, with the Republic becoming the Empire, and the Empire cared very little for Mon Cala's careful balance or its isolated prosperity. Imperial forces came, and they came with the particular cruelty reserved for people who make things of value. The shipyards that the Mon Calamari had built, the Corellan metal cities that could float or sink as the tides and seasons required, became imperial labor camps. The people who had designed vessels of grace were enslaved to build vessels of oppression. Their knowledge extracted the way one might squeeze light from a star. King Lichar, now a man grown, was imprisoned. But in that imprisonment, something unexpected happened. The Mon Calamari shipyards, operated under imperial command, but still embodying the engineering wisdom of a species born in the oceans, began producing ships that would become the backbone of the Rebel Alliance. The MC-80 cruisers were not easy for imperial crews to fly, and so often the Mon Calamari were kept aboard to maintain them, to whisper to them in the language their hands understood, to coax them to perform beyond specifications. It meant that enslaved engineers were, in a strange way, also preserving knowledge, keeping intact something the Empire could never fully own, because it lived in the water and in the hands of a people who understood displacement and pressure and how to move through a medium hostile to your frame. When the rebellion came calling, when Admiral Radis and others managed to break free or to be quietly released into the rebel fleet, the starships they brought with them were not just hardware. They carried with them the memory of floating cities, of coexistence, of learning to share a world rather than dominate it. I think about this often. That Mon Cala, a planet the Empire tried to strip of agency, the Empire enslaved and compressed, became one of the Empire's most critical undoings, not through revolution or dramatic betrayal, but through the simple fact that a species shaped by water and pressure understands, in their bones, how to survive oppression and how to build something beautiful despite it. There is something in the way Mon Cala teaches habitability not as individual survival, but as collective adaptation, as the possibility of two very different peoples sharing a world and making it richer for the sharing. And there is something in the way that same world, when occupied and enslaved, became the seed of the Empire's defeat, not because the people chose rebellion, but because the knowledge of their hands could not be taken even when their freedom could be. The ocean remembers. Let that settle with you for a moment, the idea of Mon Cala, an entire civilization below the waves, two species in careful balance, building their cities as poems written in pressure and light, and in doing so, building the instruments of their own liberation without ever planning to. There is a world in the Outer Rim where the Empire built paradise, or rather, where the Empire took a paradise that already existed and hollowed it out to serve a purpose. Scarif, when you first approach it, offers what every habitable world should. White sand beaches that stretch without end, turquoise water so clear you can see through it to the sea floor, and a climate so temperate and forgiving that the moment you step out of your ship, the air feels like a welcome. Palm-like trees cluster along the shoreline, their fronds moving in a constant, gentle breeze that never quite becomes harsh. It is the kind of place where, if you were alone, you could construct a good life. Fresh water from the tropical rainfall that cycles predictably through the seasons, fish from the shallow bays, shelter built into natural rock formations or simple structures that the weather itself seems to conspire not to damage. But you are never alone on Scarif, and that is the thing. Somewhere around 0 BBY, during the height of the Galactic Empire's power, the world became something else, a vault. Director Orson Krennic, a man whose entire existence was committed to the service of Imperial weapons development, chose Scarif as the repository for everything classified the Empire possessed. The Death Star plans, refined and perfected through years of engineering, were stored in data tapes deep within the Citadel Tower, a massive complex built into the very heart of the island archipelago. Around this tower, the Empire constructed something remarkable and terrible, a planetary shield gate, a deflector shield so vast that it enclosed the entire world. Nothing entered Scarif without permission, nothing left without passing through a single, meticulously controlled opening. The paradise became a locked box, and the key was held by men in uniform with the authority of the Emperor behind them. There were beaches still, and the turquoise water still moved as it always had, but they had been repurposed. Imperial shore troopers, wearing specialized tan armor designed for the coastal climate, adaptation to environment as we have discussed before, but adaptation in service of control, patrolled the white sand in organized formations. The trees were still beautiful, but they grew in the shadow of watchtowers. This is the question that Scarif forces us to sit with, I think, and it's one we began to touch on when we discussed Kashyyyk. What does it mean for a world to be habitable if habitability does not guarantee freedom? A Wookiee on his own forest world could be enslaved by the Empire. A refugee on Jakku could be trapped by scarcity and poverty despite breathing free air. And now we have a world where the very conditions that should sustain life have been weaponized, enclosed, and made the instrument of an entire project of galactic domination. Galen Erso understood this better than most, I think. He was brought to Scarif as the chief architect of the Death Star, a man whose extraordinary gift for engineering had been, essentially, conscripted by Director Krennic and the Empire itself. Galen had come from a life before all this, years on the remote world of Lamu with his wife Lyra and their daughter Jin, living quietly, trying to disappear from the reach of military power. But the Empire has long arms, and Krennic found him. Rather than lose his daughter, Galen complied, and he came to Scarif to oversee the construction of humanity's most terrible weapon. What we know now, what the rebellion would only later discover, is that Galen never accepted the terms of his captivity, not entirely. Working within the fortress on that tropical island, surrounded by beauty that had been converted into a prison, he secretly built a flaw into the Death Star itself, a vulnerability, a weakness that only someone reading the full technical specifications would ever notice. And those specifications, those plans, were stored in the vault beneath his feet. One might ask why he did this, why a man could work for years in the service of a weapon of such magnitude and choose to commit an act of sabotage that could cost him everything. Part of the answer, I suspect, was that he had walked onto Scarif as a functioning man and was becoming something else in that place, a person complicit in machinery far larger than himself. Part of it was love. His daughter Jin, even separated from him, remained real in a way that the Death Star project remained abstract. And part of it, I think, was the simple fact that he had spent his whole life understanding how systems work, how machines function, how a small flaw in the wrong place can cascade into catastrophic failure. He could not unknow that knowledge. In late Zero BBY, a small rebel team arrived on Scarif with the goal of stealing the full technical specifications of the Death Star. The team called itself Rogue One, Jyn Erso herself, somehow drawn back toward her father and his world, Cassian Andor, a rebel intelligence officer hardened by years of undercover work, K2SO, a droid reprogrammed from Imperial service to rebel use, his dry wit a small mercy in a mission designed to have no survivors, Chirrut Imwe, a blind warrior monk whose faith in the Force seemed almost naive until you watched him move, Baze Malbus, a mercenary and Chirrut's closest companion, armed and practical, and Bodhi Rook, a former Imperial cargo pilot who had defected to the rebellion and knew the security protocols of Scarif intimately. They came to that paradise beach as soldiers come to any battlefield, and they fought with everything they had. Imperial shore troopers in tan armor met them in the shallows. The smooth sand that should have been peaceful became a killing ground. The team pushed toward the Citadel Tower through the afternoon and into the night, knowing that they were meant to die there, that this mission was designed as a suicide run from the beginning. And as they reached the tower, As the data tapes were retrieved and the transmission sequence began, the Empire made its final, terrible calculation. Grand Moff Tarkin, commanding the Death Star in orbit above Scarif, received word of the rebel infiltration. He had a choice: send troops to suppress the uprising or demonstrate the weapon's power. He chose to fire. The Death Star, that terrible machine that had been constructed in secret, that had consumed the labor of millions, that had required the hidden genius and hidden guilt of men like Galen Erso, discharged a single blast. It was not at full power. Tarkin was being, in his own calculation, merciful, but it was enough. The Citadel Tower and the surrounding region of Scarif were obliterated in an instant. The white sand beaches, which had survived for millions of years, were scorched to black glass. The turquoise water boiled. The tropical paradise, which had been made into a vault, was made into a grave. Rogue One died on that beach. Cashin and Jin and K-2SO and Chirrut and Baze, all of them, holding the data tapes until the moment the light took them. But the transmission had gone out. The rebel fleet received the plans. And as the Death Star's blast wave expanded outward, Darth Vader himself descended to Scarif's upper atmosphere to pursue the fleeing rebel ships, his hand reaching out not to console, but to crush, not to understand, but to annihilate. What I find myself thinking about, sitting with this moment, is that Scarif teaches us something we have been circling around since the beginning of this journey, that a world's habitability is not only a matter of chemistry and climate. It is also a matter of who owns it, who controls it, and what they choose to do with that control. A world with breathable air and water and shelter can become a prison. A paradise can be made into a weapon. And sometimes the people who refuse that transformation, who fight against it, who try to transmit the truth across hostile space, are the ones who pay the price. Galen Erso's flaw in the Death Star, the vulnerability he built into the machine because he could not do otherwise, would eventually matter. It would be the thing that Luke Skywalker found, the small weakness that his own Force-guided shot would exploit, the moment when his father's unwilling choice to participate in evil would finally, silently, reduce that evil's power. But on Scarif, in that moment, all of that was still unknown. There was only the beach, and the light, and the end of beautiful things. And the knowledge that some habitable worlds are only habitable if you accept the terms of those who claim them. We have spent some time now in worlds where life is possible, where a person might find footing, build something, survive with preparation or luck or both. Naboo welcomed us with temperate weather and domed cities. Tatooine showed us how desert people eke existence from margins. Kashyyyk's forests held civilizations that understood their world so deeply they became inseparable from it. Even the difficult worlds, Hoth's glaciers, Dagobah's oppressive fog, Kamino's endless rain, demanded sacrifice but not the ultimate one. A person on Hoth could freeze to death, but it would take hours. A Tatooine settler could die of thirst, but only across days. There is mercy in that slowness, in the way a world says no gradually rather than all at once. But there is a threshold in the galaxy where that mercy ends, where the negotiation stops being whether you can survive and becomes simply, how fast will it take to kill you? I want to sit for a moment at that threshold with you, because crossing it means understanding something fundamental about what habitability truly is. It is not merely atmosphere and water and a functioning biosphere. It is the margin between your body and absolute physics. And when that margin closes to nothing, the world ceases to negotiate. Let me tell you about the moment when the rules change. When Anakin Skywalker walked out of his ship onto Mustafar in 19 BBY, the landscape beneath him was a thing that belonged to no life as you might understand it. It was a world of rivers, literal rivers, flowing with lava at temperatures that would incinerate flesh in seconds. Mustafar sits in the outer rim, a volcanic world wrapped in its own geological fury. And what makes it significant is not merely that it is hot, but that it is actively, relentlessly hostile. The native Mustafarians, divided into a tall, thin northern race and a shorter southern variety, had adapted across generations to live beneath the surface, in protected settlements, mining valuable minerals from the depths where the heat could be at least contained, managed, survived. They did not live on the surface. They lived in the spaces that the world allowed, which is to say in the spaces it could not kill them. Anakin came to that world burning with intention, and Obi-Wan came to stop him, and they fought across an active landscape of molten rock and volcanic islands, and when Obi-Wan cut him down at the edge of a lava river, Anakin fell into flames. What is strange to sit with is this. Anakin's body, burned past what recovery should allow, was pulled from that lava by Palpatine's servants, and what remained was kept alive only through machinery, through the black armor and the breathing apparatus, and the life support that would be Vader's only path to continued existence. Mustafar did not kill him outright because technology intervened, but the planet's message was clear: you do not belong here. Later, Vader built his castle there, atop a cave of Sith power, and the castle became a place where he existed in the margin between living and burning, where the world's hostility mirrored something inside him. There is a terrible poetry in that. But we need to understand what Mustafar actually is, in the moment, without Vader's machinery to mediate it. It is a world where the air itself would sear the lungs, where exposed skin would char within moments, where even the ground beneath your feet is a thin crust above molten destruction. There is no water to drink because water would boil away. There is no shelter that would not eventually fail against sustained heat. There is no biosphere because nothing living can compete with physics that absolute. Mustafar is the first true death trap we encounter on our journey, and it teaches us something vital. Habitability is not a spectrum, it is a cliff. You can imagine surviving on a harsh world by accepting difficulty, by preparing, by adapting. But Mustafar asks you to imagine transcending your own biology, and that is no longer survival. That is transformation into something else entirely. From there, the question becomes sharper. What other worlds refuse, in that same absolute way, to let human life take root? On Hoth, in the Outer Rim, the Rebel Alliance made the terrible choice to establish Echo Base during the Galactic Civil War, on an ice world where the tundra spreads endless, and the glaciers define the landscape and blizzards blow with the kind of constancy that makes you understand why so few beings would choose to settle there. But Hoth, unlike Mustafar, can be survived with preparation. The cold there will kill you, night temperatures plunge to lethal lows, and an unprotected being left in that darkness for hours will not wake. But the rebels had shelters, heated compounds, Tauntauns bred, and adapted to provide both transportation and warmth through their own body heat. Han Solo, trying to keep Luke Skywalker alive in the snow, cut open a Tauntaun and laid him inside the creature's body cavity for warmth. A moment of brutal, desperate survival that worked because the world permitted it, barely. Hoth is a world where preparation and technology and desperate knowledge can extend your life past the point where you would otherwise freeze. Mustafar permits nothing. And then there is Dagobah, where Yoda lived in exile for 2 decades after Order 66, and where the atmosphere is breathable and the world sustains life, but life of such a nature, swamp and fog and dragon snakes and the constant weight of moisture, that it seems designed to wear away at any hope of permanence. Dagobah is almost cruelly livable. You will not burn, you will not freeze, but you will be slowly, steadily ground down by dampness and heat, and the relentless encroachment of a jungle that remembers neither you nor your name. It teaches us that a world can be survivable and still reject human thriving, that habitability and comfort are not the same thing. And that distinction matters as we move toward the truly lethal worlds. Because there are planets where the equation is no longer whether you can live, but only how long until you die. Geonosis is one, a dry, rocky desert in the Outer Rim, home to the insectoid Genosians who built underground hive cities and droid factories, whose atmosphere is thin enough that humans would struggle to breathe, whose very aridity makes it a place where water is a luxury you cannot reliably find. Mustafar, Genosis, and the worlds beyond them are not difficult worlds that reward those stubborn or clever enough to master them. They are refusals. They are the galaxy saying, without equivocation, this place is not for you. And the reason I want to sit here at this threshold, at this turning point, is that it marks something important in how we have to think about what a planet means. It is not just a thing. It is a boundary. And on one side of that boundary, a life, however hard, is possible. On the other side, only adaptation or machinery or the force itself keeps you in being. We are about to cross that boundary together, and I want you to understand what it means. What it means for a world to be not merely hard, but impossible, not merely demanding, but final. So let us take a breath, here on the habitable side, and prepare to move into the places where breathing itself becomes a negotiation. There is a kind of planet that does not negotiate with life, and Mustafar is perhaps the clearest example the galaxy offers of what that means. It sits in the outer rim, in the Atravis sector, a small world orbiting its star in a slow, relentless dance, and what you find there is almost too extreme to hold comfortably in the mind. The surface is not land as you would recognize it. It is a geography of fire, rivers of molten lava flowing like terrible rivers across a blackened stone canvas, lakes of liquid heat that glow orange and red in the perpetual ash-filled sky. To stand unprotected on Mustafar is to stand in a furnace where the ground itself is trying to kill you, where the very air you might try to breathe is laden with caustic gases and volcanic ash that would scar your lungs in moments. The heat alone is incompatible with human flesh. The temperature near the lava flows climbs to levels that will ignite organic tissue as readily as kindling takes a spark. And yet, and I find this detail haunting, during the Clone Wars era, there were those who chose to go there, who built platforms and facilities on rocky outcroppings suspended above the inferno, mining operations run by the Techno Union in service of the separatists. The miners would ride lava skiffs, vessels designed to withstand the heat, and extract valuable minerals from the lava itself, pulling ore from the molten rivers as if harvesting crops from fields of stone and fire. These were not idealists. They were workers, many of them doing what survival demanded, and the fact that it was possible at all speaks to the remarkable engineering humans can summon when desperation or profit calls. The Mustafarians themselves, the native species of the planet, divided into northern and southern populations, had adapted to this world in ways that leave me deeply uncertain about what adaptation truly costs. They were smaller than humans, their bodies shaped by generations of life in volcanic furnaces, and they rode creatures called lava fleas, massive insectoid animals capable of clinging to scalding rock walls and surviving near the heat that would consume any unmodified human in seconds. There is something almost unbearable in contemplating what it must mean to be native to a world that would kill your neighbors, to have your biology woven so thoroughly into a landscape of fire that you cannot imagine living anywhere else. That comfort itself is a kind of slow death. Now, Mustafar enters our story not merely as a hostile geography, but as the stage for one of the most consequential moments in galactic history. And it is worth holding that connection carefully, because it reveals something important about how worlds shape the events that occur upon them. In the final days of the Clone Wars, as the separatist movement crumbled before the advancing clone armies, Darth Sidious made a strategic decision. He moved the leadership of the Separatist Council to Mustafar, to a control room overlooking the lava, placing them on a world so inherently lethal that few would dare pursue them there. Newt Gunray, the Viceroy of the Trade Federation, and the other leaders of the separatist cause, Rune Harko, San Hill, Wat Tamba, Po Nudo and Tix, found themselves in a fortress of heat and flame, believing themselves safe precisely because the planet itself was the guardian. But Sidious had no intention of letting them live. He sent Anakin Skywalker, now calling himself Darth Vader, to Mustafar to kill them, and Anakin walked into that volcanic inferno and ended the Separatist leadership himself, severing the head from the movement, and in doing so, ending the Clone Wars not with negotiation or stalemate, but with the definitive murder of a government. What happened next is the hinge upon which the entire catastrophe turns. Padmé Amidala, who had learned that Anakin had become involved in the killings, traveled to Mustafar to confront him, hoping still to reach the man she loved beneath the dark robes and the new name. On that burning world, Anakin force-joked her, believing in his anguish that Obi-Wan had corrupted her, that she had conspired against him, and she fell unconscious as the world burned around her. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had stowed away aboard her ship in secret, stepped forward then into the furnace, and he and Anakin dueled across Mustafar's mining platforms and collection facilities, moving over lava falls, across floating platforms, their lightsabers brilliant against the volcanic inferno. The duel lasted long enough for Obi-Wan to work his way to higher ground, and there, on a platform above the lava, he struck, severing Anakin's legs and his left arm in a single motion. Anakin fell, burning, into the heat and the ash, and the man who had carried within him more raw force potential than anyone in recorded history was unmade in the fires of a world that did not care how powerful he had been, that did not negotiate with the strength of his midi-chlorians or the depth of his capacity for the Force. The planet simply burned him. Darth Sidious arrived afterward, recovered the smoking, barely alive remains of Anakin Skywalker, and took him away to be rebuilt into the suit, the armor, the breathing apparatus, the vast life support system that would become Darth Vader, the man-machine that could not survive without mechanical intervention on any world in the galaxy. What Mustafar gave to history then was not merely a place where consequential events occurred, but a space where fire and stone and heat became the visible form of transformation, where a man was literally unmade and reconstructed into something else entirely. And later, I want to note this gently, Vader himself returned to Mustafar. The planet called to him, and he built a fortress there, a stronghold rising from the volcanic rock and ash, constructed using principles drawn from Sith knowledge, built atop a dark side vergence, a place where the dark side itself seemed to concentrate and gather like storm clouds above a mountain. Some of the legends say this was the work of a Sith Lord named Darth Momin, whose mask Vader wore, and that through this mask and through this fortress, Vader sought to touch realms beyond death itself, seeking always for some way to undo the loss of Padmé, to recover what Mustafar had taken from him. The planet became, in a sense, his home, not a place he chose for its beauty or resources, but a place he returned to because the fires there understood him, because a world of absolute destruction could house a man who was himself destroyed and endlessly reconstructing. And I think that is the true horror of Mustafar, the thing that distinguishes it from mere geological hostility. It is a planet where no human can survive without complete technological intervention or transformation, where the very idea of simply walking unprotected is not a risk, but an immediate and inevitable death. It is a planet that has hosted the destruction of governments, the dismantling of the most powerful force user of his age, and the birth of perhaps the galaxy's most significant tragedy. And it remains, even now, a world of molten rivers and ash-filled skies, where the Mustafarians continue their ancient patterns on their lava fleas, adapted to fire in ways we can perhaps understand but never truly share, living on a world that teaches us that some planets do not merely resist life. They transform it, break it, and force it into shapes that are no longer entirely its own. If Mustafar teaches us that fire and lava can unmake a human being in hours, then Geonosis teaches us something perhaps more unsettling, that a world need not be geologically violent to be utterly incompatible with life, as we understand it. Geonosis orbits a red giant star in the outer rim, and the entire planet seems to have absorbed the color of that dying light, rust-red rock formations, spires that rise like the exoskeletons of insects frozen mid-molt, and beneath it all, an atmosphere so thin and caustic that an unprotected human would feel their lungs begin to burn within minutes of breathing it. The desert surface is cruel and barren, a landscape of mesas and badlands where nothing soft grows, where water is non-existent, and where the only intelligence that has ever truly flourished is insectoid, evolved over millions of years to thrive in conditions that would be immediately fatal to us. This is the homeworld of the Genosians, and to understand Genosis is to understand that not all worlds kill you through volcanic heat or airless cold. Some kill you through absolute, systematic refusal to accommodate your biology. The Genosians themselves are a species of extraordinary adaptability, and that adaptability is the key to everything that follows. They are insectoid, their bodies angular and chitinous, their hands manipulating with precision that seems almost surgical, their communication a rapid series of clicks and chirps, a language of the hive that human vocal cords cannot even approximate. Their society is organized around caste the way a termite colony is organized, not as a choice, but as an inheritance written into their biology. There is a winged aristocratic caste, small in number, mobile by flight, capable of thought and decision and the holding of power. And there is an enormous underclass of drones, wingless, expendable, designed for labor and for war, created in such numbers that individual Genosian drones have essentially no value. A single drone could be sacrificed without thought, and there would be 10,000 more to replace it, and this mechanical cruelty embedded in their own reproductive system made them ideal for something that would later become central to who they were, the manufacture of droids. During the Clone Wars era, under Archduke Poggle the Lesser, Genosis became the industrial heart of the separatist movement. Vast droid foundries carved into the rock and deep caverns, assembly lines producing battle droids by the millions, a world that had turned its own insectoid organizational logic outward into starship-sized murder. And this is where our story grows dark, in a different way than Mustafar's fire. In 22 BBY, Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived on Genosis investigating the kidnapping of a young politician named Padme Amidala, and instead walked directly into a trap laid by Count Dooku, who was secretly Darth Tyrannus, apprentice to Palpatine. Obi-Wan was captured, and when Anakin Skywalker came to rescue him, he too was taken, and Padme was apprehended as she tried to help, 3 prisoners in the hands of a hive species that regarded them with something less than curiosity. Poggle the Lesser sentenced them to death by public execution in the Petranaki Arena, a vast cavern amphitheater where Genosians gathered to watch condemned beings torn apart by beasts. 3 creatures were loosed upon them: the Acklay, a mantis-like predator with blades for limbs; the Reek, a horned brute of pure muscle and rage; and the Nexu, a feline apex predator built for the hunt. I want you to sit with what that means. Not battle, not a fair contest, but execution as public spectacle, the way a hive processes those it has deemed disposable. Anakin and Obi-Wan fought back with a skill that turned survival into a display, but they were seconds from death when Yoda arrived with an army. The Genosian leadership had not known that the clone trooper army existed, that the Jedi had been secretly building a military through the cloning facilities on Kamino, and the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Republic soldiers transformed the Petranaki Arena into a battle, the first battle of the Clone Wars itself. Mace Windu fought across the sand, Yoda dueled with Dooku, who escaped, and in the chaos, something ancient began to wake. Deep within the Genosian catacombs, those vast network of tunnels that honeycomb the planet beneath the surface, there existed something that had ruled long before Poggle, before the hives, perhaps before the current Genosian civilization itself. Queen Karina the Great, a monarch of terrible age and terrible hunger, was entombed in the deepest darkness, and she had the power to animate the dead, to control them through parasitic worms that lived in the nervous systems of fallen Genosians, transforming corpses into puppets. Years later, when the Separatists rebuilt their foundries, when Anakin and Obi-Wan returned with Ki-Adi-Mundi and Luminara Unduli, and a young Padawan named Ahsoka Tano to destroy what had been rebuilt, the Second Battle of Geonosis descended into those very catacombs. In the darkness, Barriss Offee, Luminara's own Padawan, was infected by one of those brain worms, and Ahsoka nearly suffered the same fate before Cold. The one thing those parasites could not survive killed the infection before it could take her. But what I find myself thinking about is this. The atmosphere of Geonosis is so thin, so hostile to human respiration, that a Jedi cannot spend hours in those caverns without facing the slow asphyxiation of the world itself. The Geonosians thrive in exactly the conditions that suffocate us. Their hives are built into spires that pierce that thin air. Their tunnels burrow into the planet at an angle that makes breathing impossible for anything that evolved on Naboo or Coruscant. This is not a world that became lethal. It is a world that was born lethal to human life, and the Geonosians built their entire civilization in its margins, turning its refusal into their foundation. And then, at the end of the Clone Wars, when Palpatine achieved his final victory and became Emperor, he made a decision about Geonosis that was perhaps the most complete genocide in the records of the galaxy. The Death Star plans had been given to Poggle the Lesser. If Geonosians lived, they might remember, might speak of it, might become a liability. So the Empire came not to conquer Geonosis, but to sterilize it, to reduce its population to nearly nothing, leaving only silence in those hives that had once hummed with billions of clicks and chittering communications. A handful survived, Click-Clack, a Geonosian who would live long enough to shelter a queen egg in hidden places, waiting for a resurrection that might never come. But the world itself remained, thin-aired and hostile, a monument to a species that had adapted perfectly to conditions that no other civilization could survive, and then had been nearly erased because of what they had been forced to build there. There is something in that, the tragedy of a world that saves you because you are made for it, and then destroys you because you are too useful, too connected to secrets that powerful people want buried. Geonosis teaches us that survival is not merely a matter of atmosphere and water. It teaches us that a world can be perfect for the wrong species and lethal for the right one, and that sometimes the most horrible deaths occur not in fire, but in systems of control that transform life itself into the instrument of extinction. Cloud City floats in the upper atmosphere of Bespin, a gas giant in the anode sector of the Outer Rim, suspended roughly 60,000 kilometers above a core that would crush and incinerate anything that sank toward it. The city exists in what the miners call the life zone, a narrow band of habitable atmosphere where the air is breathable, the temperature survivable, the pressure something human lungs and bodies can negotiate without armor or augmentation. Below that band, Bespin's atmosphere grows denser and hotter and more hostile with each kilometer descended, becoming not just unpleasant but actively lethal, a suffocating tomb of pressure and poisonous density that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. What keeps Cloud City aloft is not Earth or bedrock, but repulsor lift technology and a reactor system anchored deep in a central stalk, a vast mechanism that holds the city suspended in an equilibrium it can never take for granted. The city's reason for existing is Tibanna gas, a rare and valuable substance that floats in Bespin's upper atmosphere, drawn from the clouds themselves and processed in refineries deep within the facility's honeycomb of chambers and stacks. Tibanna is used across the galaxy as a hyperdrive coolant and as an amplifier for blaster weapons. The Empire's hunger for it is voracious, which means the city that mines it has always existed in a precarious relationship with Imperial power. During the reign of Palpatine's Empire, the city was administered by Lando Calrissian, who had won his stake in Cloud City through a game of sabacc, a card game where fortunes turned on a single hand, and had managed to run it with enough independence and shrewdness to stay largely below Imperial notice. Lando was not a rebel, but he was not fully enslaved either. He had built a kind of tightrope walk between profitability and autonomy, the sort of balance that only works as long as you are not noticed by the people with absolute power. Managing the city's vast systems was Lobot, a cyborg aide whose mind was integrated into the city's computational core through an interface device spanning his head, making him less a servant and more a living bridge between machine and man. The city employed Ugnaughts, porcine humanoid beings from a world elsewhere in the Outer Rim, as laborers in the mining and processing operations, working in conditions that were survivable for humans, but exhausting, dangerous, repetitive. One of the city's most distinctive facilities was its carbon freezing chamber, a vast industrial apparatus designed to flash freeze Tibanna gas for transport, a process so brutal and so perfect that it left matter suspended in crystallized stasis, unchanged and unchanging. All of this existed in a careful balance. A city that was, in its way, a genuine achievement, a testament to what beings could build when they learned to live not on a planet, but in the margins of hostile space, breathing air that was there by accident and held aloft by will and engineering. But balance requires that all parties continue to honor the agreement, and Lando Calrissian's tightrope was tested when the rebellion came to him in desperate need. The Millennium Falcon, fleeing the rebel base on Hoth with Han Solo, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, and C-3PO aboard, had suffered a failed hyperdrive and sought refuge in Cloud City's landing platforms, a sanctuary offered by Lando to his old friend Han Solo. What Lando did not know, and could not have known, was that Darth Vader and the Empire had already arrived and were waiting, having set a trap into which the Falcon was flying blind. The confrontation that followed was brief but absolute. Vader gave Lando a choice, the kind of choice that is not really a choice at all, between surrendering his friends or watching his city burn. Lando chose what most would choose in that moment. He yielded and agreed to help the Empire capture the rebels in exchange for a promise that the city would not be destroyed. But there is something you learn about promises made to the Empire watching the history of this era unfold. They're kept only insofar as they remain useful. Before Lando and Vader had finished speaking, the city's detention blocks were being filled and its corridors were being militarized, and the careful balance Lando had maintained, that precarious walk between independence and subjugation, collapsed into something far more simple and far more final. In the detention levels, Han Solo was tortured, not for information, as torture is often portrayed, but as a kind of demonstration, a reminder of what the Empire's power could do to a body, what pain looked like when applied without limit or mercy. The carbon freezing chamber, designed to suspend Tibanna gas, was repurposed into something entirely different. A test subject, a way of seeing if the process that froze matter could freeze living flesh, could suspend a human being in crystalline stasis and keep him that way until he was useful again. Han Solo was the test, and he was suspended in carbonite, encased in a shell of hardened carbon that left only his face visible, a death that was not quite death, a form of unexistence that might one day be reversed or might one day be permanent. The bounty hunter Boba Fett, who had been pursuing Han across the galaxy to claim the price on his head for Jabba the Hutt, watched this happen. And when Han's carbonite shell had hardened and cooled, Fett took possession of his quarry and departed the city aboard his vessel, Slave Eye, to carry Han back to Tatooine and to whatever fate the Hutt had waiting there. But the Empire was not finished with Cloud City, and the promise Vader had made to Lando, that the city would not be destroyed, had already begun its unraveling. Luke Skywalker, sensing through the Force that his friends were in danger, came to Cloud City despite warning from his Jedi teacher Yoda, a choice driven by the same impulse that had destroyed Anakin Skywalker a generation before, the need to save those he loved, even when saving them might destroy him. Luke and Vader dueled through the city's chambers and corridors, moving across platforms and catwalks, the duel growing more desperate and more intimate as the two figures moved deeper into the facility, until they reached a central air shaft, a reactor shaft descending down into the stalk that held the city aloft. In that shaft, suspended above the machinery that kept Cloud City hovering in its precarious balance, Vader severed Luke's right hand and revealed the truth that had been hidden from Luke his entire life. That the father Luke had believed was dead was standing in front of him, that he himself was the son of Anakin Skywalker, that he carried the blood of the Sith in his veins. Luke fell down the shaft, his severed hand falling with him, tumbling through the empty air above the city's depths, and only managed to catch himself on a weather vane antenna extending from the city's underside, hanging thousands of meters above the clouds below, with nothing between him and the lethal depths of Bespin's atmosphere. From that precipice, Luke reached out through the Force and called to the Millennium Falcon, which had been fleeing across the city's exterior, and Leia heard him or felt him. The two had always been connected in ways they did not yet understand, and Lando, who had finally chosen the rebellion over the Empire's promises, brought the Falcon back to pull Luke to safety. When Lando announced the evacuation through the city's communication systems, his voice echoing through corridors and chambers, it was not a military announcement, but something sadder. An acknowledgement that Cloud City, the achievement Lando had built and maintained, was no longer his, was no longer anyone's, but the Empire's, and that those who wished to live would have to leave it behind. Those who could not flee fast enough remained, and Cloud City became not a haven but a garrison, a floating fortress in the Anode sector serving imperial purposes, its miners and workers and administrators absorbed into the machinery of occupation. There is something in that collapse worth sitting with, I think. The way a place that was genuinely habitable, where the atmosphere was breathable and the conditions were survivable and beings had built something remarkable, could become lethal not because the air had changed, but because the people in power had decided it was theirs, and that others no longer had the right to breathe there. Cloud City teaches us that survivability is not only a matter of atmosphere and pressure, of gravity and chemistry. It is also a matter of will, and whether those who command power permit you to remain alive. You find yourself arriving at Crate in the imagination as a place of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the particular silence of a world that has been stripped down to its essential geology, to salt and mineral, and the memory of everything that has worn away. It lies in the outer rim territories, far from the core worlds, a planet that asks almost nothing of those who stumble upon it and offers almost nothing in return. The surface is white, a vast, brilliant white of crystalline salt layered thick across the entire landscape, ancient and undisturbed, catching the light in a way that seems almost cruel in its brightness. Beneath that salt crust lies something else entirely, mineral deposits of deep red, oxide-rich earth that remembers what this world was before the salt took dominion. When something moves across that salt, when a creature or a vehicle breaks through that thin, frozen skin, the red reveals itself, streaking out like a wound, like the world is bleeding beneath its white surface. This is what we will return to, what matters most. The geography of Crate is not hostile in the way Mustafar is hostile, with active violence and heat that unmakes flesh, but in the way of absolute refusal, a world that will not sustain you and makes no apology for it. The atmosphere is breathable. You could walk there without a mask, draw breath, and your lungs would accept it. There is water, perhaps, locked in the mineral beneath, but not accessible, not in the quantities that matter for survival. The cold is there, a frozen harshness that would wear on you over days, but Crate's cruelty is not primarily in temperature. Its cruelty is in the simple, implacable fact. There is nothing to eat on Crate, nothing that grows, nothing that can sustain human life over any meaningful duration. And yet, in the final hours of the Resistance War, when General Leia Organa and what remained of her fighters fled the destruction of their fleet, hunted through hyperspace by the First Order, stripped of ships and soldiers and hope, they came to Crate. This is important. Crate was not an accident, not a random refuge, but a known place, a memory embedded in the rebellion's own history. Decades before the resistance, in the early days of the rebellion against the Empire, a base had been established here in the Salt Flats, a foothold in the Outer Rim, strategically hidden, practically impossible to defend. That base had been abandoned long ago, left to the salt and the silence and the few native creatures. Small, fox-like animals called vulptices, crystal foxes made of or covered in living crystalline structures, their bodies chiming and resonating as they moved. The vulptices thrived here in a way nothing human could. They belonged to Crate in the way the Uoks belonged to Endor, or the Tusken Raiders belonged to Tatooine, through adaptation, so complete it seemed natural. When the Resistance returned to that old bunker, they were not returning to a home, but to a grave, to the skeleton of something the galaxy had moved beyond. And the First Order, under the command of Kylo Ren after the death of Supreme Leader Snoke, came behind them with walkers, AT-M-6 walkers, the largest ground assault vehicles in the First Order's arsenal, taller and more heavily armored than anything the Rebellion had ever fielded against the Empire's AT-ATs. These were followed by something worse, a superlaser siege cannon, a miniaturized battering weapon that seemed to carry within it an echo of the Death Star itself, a tool designed for one purpose alone, to crack open the world until the people inside were exposed. The Resistance had perhaps 100 fighters left, maybe fewer, scattered across the galaxy and converging on Crate because there was nowhere else to go, because the salt was neutral and the isolation absolute. They deployed what they had, aging V-4XD ski speeders, lightweight craft that kicked up the red mineral beneath the salt as they moved, tracing red wounds across the white landscape, beautiful and desperate and utterly inadequate against what was coming. I find myself thinking about what it meant, in that moment, that Crate could not sustain life, but could, through its very barrenness, sustain a last stand. The speeders were fast because they were light, and they were light because they were old, because the Rebellion and the Resistance had never had the resources of the Empire or the First Order, and so everything they built had to be lean and improvised. The walkers moved toward the blast door of the bunker, and the speeders circled them like insects troubling a giant, and the cannon began its work on the sealed entrance where the last Resistance survivors huddled in the dark. And then Luke Skywalker, the mythic figure, the last Jedi, the man who had burned out his own story decades ago in exile, appeared on the Salt Flats in a form that could not be touched, a projection cast across the galaxy through the Force itself, so far from his body that the effort would unmake him. He confronted Kylo Ren, his nephew, the boy he had failed, and the man he had feared, on the white salt. And for a moment, the battle paused, attention drawn inward to that duel of history and grief, and the weight of everything between them. And in that pause, the Resistance survivors did what they had left to do. They fled, pushing past the crushing pressure of desperation, using a way out that seemed sealed until Rey, herself a young woman moving through her own crisis of identity and power, lifted rocks with the Force. Ancient stones moved by will alone to clear the escape tunnel. They fled through the catacombs of the old base, the vulptices leading them in a strange communion between crystal fox and human, through passages that had been hidden for decades, down into the earth beneath the salt. They emerged with what they could carry, climbed aboard the Millennium Falcon, that ship again, that ship which has carried every story worth telling, and lifted away from Crate as Luke Skywalker's projection faded, as the effort of holding his image across the parsecs finally broke him, as he passed into the Force and became something else entirely. What remained on Crate was the salt, unmarked again, already forgetting the red streaks the speeders had carved into it, already returning to its white silence, to its absolute refusal to sustain anything but what belonged to it from the beginning. This is the cruelty of Crate. It is not actively hostile like Mustafar, not poisoned in its air like Geonosis, not dependent on technologies that can fail. It is simply, finally, a world that has nothing to give. And yet, in the moment when everything else failed, when power and weapons and numbers meant nothing, Crate held a memory of refuge, a place where the desperate could make their last stand. where the planet's very barrenness became a kind of shelter. And perhaps there is something in that, the idea that some worlds kill not with violence but with indifference, and that indifference can sometimes be the only honest ground left to stand on. There is a world we have not yet spoken about, though it has haunted the edges of nearly everything we have discussed, a place where the ground itself seems to remember suffering, where the very air carries the weight of ancient rage, and where the habitability question is not whether you can survive, but whether the world itself will permit you to approach it at all. Korriban lies in the outer rim, orbiting a red star called Horuset, a desolate and barren landscape of rocky, reddish terrain, where dust storms move across the dunes like the breath of something vast and angry. There is almost no water there, almost no vegetation, almost nothing that would suggest life is welcome. And yet, for thousands of years, it was the center of an empire. To understand Korriban, we must go back very far, to times so ancient that the Jedi Order itself was still young, and there existed a schism so profound that it would echo across millennia. Around 6,900 years before the Skywalker saga, there was a conflict known as the 100-Year Darkness, in which a group of Force-sensitive beings, Jedi technically, though they had begun to pursue a different path than the Temple had ever sanctioned, were defeated and exiled from the Republic. These Dark Jedi, as they came to be called, fled across the stars, seeking refuge, seeking a place where they could practice their understanding of the Force without the Jedi Order's judgment standing over them. And they found Korriban. On that barren world, they encountered a native species, the Sith, red-skinned and Force-sensitive in their own right, a people who had built a primitive civilization on a world that wanted nothing to do with life. The Dark Jedi did not settle among the Sith as equals. They presented themselves as gods, and the Sith, who had no context for resistance, accepted them as such. And in that moment, something shifted. The term Sith ceased to mean the native species and began to mean the Order itself, the philosophy, the pursuit of power through domination, and the dark side of the Force. Ajunta Paul was among these exiles, one of the first to make Korriban home, and he took the native Sith people as subjects, as a civilization to rule. The tombs in the Valley of the Dark Lords began to rise then, massive mausoleums where the dead would be preserved, where their power might somehow persist beyond death. This is not merely architecture, this is obsession made stone. Over the centuries that followed, Korriban became a pilgrimage site for dark side practitioners, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to thin. Great Dark Lords were entombed there. Tilak Horde, a master of the blade whose reputation for cruelty outlasted empires, Ludo Kresh, who competed for power and dominion, and Marka Ragnos, who reigned so long and so absolutely that when he died, the power struggle that followed nearly tore the Sith apart. I find myself thinking about what it means that these beings, who had devoted their lives to the pursuit of individual power and domination, sought so desperately to ensure that power persisted after death. It suggests something almost desperate, a kind of reaching beyond the grave, a refusal to accept that even the strongest Force user must eventually yield to mortality. Marka Ragnos' death itself became a moment of violent transition. His funeral was interrupted by the conflict between his successors, and Naga Sado ultimately prevailed. Naga Sado rose to lead the Sith Empire in what would be called the Great Hyperspace War, around 5,000 years before the saga, launching an assault against the Galactic Republic itself. The war was brief and, from the Sith perspective, catastrophic. The Sith Empire was devastated, its forces scattered, its fleets destroyed, and the survivors forced into exile and obscurity. And Korriban, the spiritual center of everything, became a world of tombs and echoes. It was abandoned, gradually, as the great Sith Lords died, and no one was left to maintain the facade of power. Yet it was never truly empty. Those who studied the dark side, and there were always those who did, returned to Korriban, drawn by something they could neither entirely name nor resist. The planet had accumulated centuries of dark side energy. Sith alchemy had been worked into the very stone. Rituals had been performed so intensely and so frequently that the boundary between the physical and the spiritual seemed to have collapsed entirely. The tombs were not merely monuments. They were repositories, places where the spirits of the dead seemed to linger, where an apprentice might find not stone and bone, but something more active, more present, more dangerous. Darth Bane, the architect of the Rule of Two, came to Korriban to study the tombs of his predecessors, to understand the knowledge they had encoded in their deaths. And when the Sith were reborn, when the Order was rebuilt in secret and in exile, Korriban became once again a center. A Sith Academy rose, a place where the new generation of dark side practitioners was trained, where they were tested and broken and remade in the image of power. But here is what strikes me most powerfully about Korriban. It is not a place where survival is difficult. It is a place where survival itself seems almost irrelevant. The question of breathable atmosphere, of water, of shelter, these are practical concerns that Korriban simply does not address. A person arriving there unprotected would face the same death as on Mustafar or Geonosis, and yet Korriban's lethality is of a different order entirely. Mustafar and Geonosis kill the body. Korriban kills something deeper. There is a weight to the place, a presence, a sense that the ground itself remembers every act of cruelty, every moment of domination, every ritual that was performed in the name of power. People have spoken of standing in the Valley of the Dark Lords and feeling as though they were being watched by the dead, that the tombs themselves were aware, that to breathe the air of Korriban was to breathe the exhalation of centuries of rage and ambition and grief. This is not scientific observation. It is phenomenological testimony. And it matters because it reveals something about why Korriban is lethal in a way that transcends the merely environmental. A world that has been so thoroughly saturated with dark side energy, a world where thousands of Force users, all pursuing power, all willing to sacrifice anything and anyone, have lived and died and been entombed. Such a world does not merely kill the careless. It reaches into the mind, into the spirit, into the fundamental sense of self that allows a person to exist as a coherent being. To survive Korriban, even if you possessed perfect shelter and equipment, you would have to carry something with you, a sense of purpose, a centered will, something that would allow you to walk through centuries of accumulated darkness without being unmade by it. Most people, most of us, do not possess that. And so Korriban remains what it has always been, a dead world that is never truly silent, a desert that echoes with voices that have been dead for millennia, a place where the question is not whether you can survive, but whether you should attempt to survive it at all. There is something in the way ancient powers build tombs and call them immortality, something in the way a desolate world can become a center of spiritual gravity, that whispers a question we have not yet directly confronted. What is the difference between a world that refuses life and a world that actively resists it? Korriban teaches us that the answer may lie not in the planet's chemistry, but in its memory. There is a world that most beings never reach, hidden so thoroughly in the unknown regions that to stumble upon it by accident is to die in the approach, your ship torn apart by electromagnetic storms and the sheer refusal of the galaxy to let you through. Exegol was not discovered by accident, and it was not discovered by choice. It was reached only by those who carried a wayfinder, a small pyramidal device shaped by Sith hands thousands of years ago to guide the faithful through the darkness. There are only two wayfinders known to have survived into the modern era. One was kept by Emperor Palpatine himself, clutched in the machinery of his will. The other lay hidden in the ruins of the second Death Star, in the Emperor's own throne room, waiting in the dark. When Kylo Ren, hunting for answers about his lineage and his power, found that wayfinder in the wreckage on Kef Bir, he was finding more than a map. He was finding a thread that led backward through the Sith to something even older, something that should have stayed buried. Deep beneath Exegol's surface, where the sky above churns with perpetual storm and lightning tears through clouds that never break, the Sith Eternal had made their home. These were not soldiers or governors or scholars in any ordinary sense. They were cultists, engineers, loyalists who had devoted their lives and deaths to a single unshakable belief: that the Sith were eternal, that the Order could not fall, that it must rise again. They had built caverns vast enough to house entire cities, carved into the dark rock of a world that had never asked to sustain them, and inside those caverns they had built what amounted to a resurrection engine. Palpatine, the man who had orchestrated the fall of the Jedi, who had ruled the galaxy as Emperor, who should have been destroyed on the second Death Star, had not died at all. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that he had died, and they had refused to accept it. The machinery beneath Exegol was the work of decades, maybe centuries. Cloning vats, life support apparatus, dark side sorcery twisted into mechanical form. All of it designed to keep a single consciousness alive, to resurrect it, to bind it back into flesh when flesh had failed. When the Sith Eternal finally drew him back into being, Palpatine did not wake refreshed. He woke into a body failing around him, held together by machines, the way a corpse is held together by rigor and gravity. There's something deeply unsettling about that image. The Emperor, who had seemed like the apex of power, suspended on a crane-like apparatus like meat on a hook, tubes and wires running through him. His breath given to him by machinery because his own lungs had forgotten how to work. But the dark side does not care about dignity, and in the caverns of Exegol, there was no one left who would dare to care for him. Deep in those same caverns, they kept the bodies of the failed clones, the experiments that had not taken, the genetic material that had not held, all the attempts to remake a man and make him eternal. One of them had a son, or perhaps was a son. The distinction blurs when you are dealing with Sith science and the question of what makes a life matter. That clone, that failed resurrection of Palpatine, had broken free at some point, fled the depths of Exegol into the wider galaxy, found love, had a daughter, and died trying to protect her from the world that made him. His daughter was Rey. That blood, that genetic echo of the Emperor, was running through her body without her knowing it, a fact so buried that she did not learn it until she was standing in the Sith throne chamber itself, face to face with the man who had willed her entire bloodline into being. The Final Order rose from Exegol like a fleet of phantoms, hundreds of Zeiston-class star destroyers, each one equipped with an axial superlaser that could crack a planet open like an egg. They had been built in secret over generations, hidden in the caverns and buried in the stone, waiting for the moment when Palpatine's restored consciousness would give the order to rise through the storm clouds and begin the erasure of everything that had dared to believe the Empire had fallen. Kylo Ren, arriving at Exegol with the Wayfinder, found an Emperor who offered him a gift. The galaxy, remade, his to rule, the Final Order his weapon. And perhaps in that moment, Kylo Ren wanted it, wanted power without ambiguity, wanted to be chosen by something older and darker than doubt. But something had changed in him between Starkiller Base and the caverns of Exegol, something that no amount of dark side fury could fully suppress. When the Resistance arrived, led by Poe Dameron and General Finn, their fleet joined by a massive volunteer armada of ordinary people piloted by Lando Calrissian and Chewbacca, the sky above Exegol filled with light. In the throne chamber, surrounded by the Sith Eternal cultists who had served as witnesses to the resurrection, Rey stood before Palpatine in his failing, magnificent horror, and Kylo Ren, no longer entirely himself and not yet wholly redeemed, came to stand beside her. Palpatine had always believed that conflict itself was strength, that the desire for power proven in violence was the truest test of worthiness. And in his final moment, when both Rey and Ben Solo faced him together, he tried to use that belief as a weapon. He pulled life force from them both, draining them to restore his own body to something approaching wholeness, trying to prove that he alone was strong enough to survive. But Rey held the lightsabers of Luke and Leia Skywalker, and when Palpatine's own Force lightning, amplified by his restored power, came screaming toward her, she reflected it back into him. The Sith eternal cultists died in that moment, their devotion burning away in the light of their master's obliteration. The final order, leaderless and purposeless, scattered across the storm-dark sky of a planet that had never wanted to be the center of anything. And Exegol, that hidden dread, that carefully buried tomb, fell back into darkness. There is a bitter mercy in thinking about a world like Exegol, not because it is gone, but because it ever had to exist at all. It was not a world that evolution shaped or ecosystems balanced. It was an act of will imposed on stone, a refusal to accept limitation, carved into caverns and held together by machinery and cruelty. There is no way to survive on Exegol without that apparatus, without that careful, poisoned care. You cannot breathe its air for long. You cannot drink its water. You cannot rest your feet on its barren surface without knowing that beneath you lies a tomb of Sith ambition. But what is most lethal about Exegol is not the storm or the barren ground. It is what it represents, a world built entirely to sustain the will of the dead, a place where survival itself is an act of defiance against the natural order. To live on Exegol is to accept that you are not living at all, only being kept alive by something that does not love you and never will. We have walked through the survivable worlds and watched them recede into the distance, and now we arrive at the harder question. Why exactly do some planets refuse us entirely? It is not enough to say they are hostile. We must understand the machinery of that hostility, the specific ways in which a world's chemistry and geology and biology align to make human life not merely difficult, but fundamentally impossible without extraordinary intervention. Let us begin with temperature, because it is perhaps the most primal of all planetary variables, and because Mustafar teaches us what happens when the ordinary range of human tolerance is exceeded so completely that survival becomes a question not of minutes or hours, but of moments. Mustafar orbits between two gas giants, Jestefad and Lefrani, and the gravitational tug-of-war between them creates constant internal friction that manifests as volcanic fury, rivers of lava, seas of molten rock, an atmosphere so thick with ash and toxic compounds that each breath would scald human lungs to uselessness. The surface temperature in exposed areas exceeds what a human body can process, not just through sweating or seeking shelter, but in an absolute sense. The heat radiates through any conventional protection and begins to cook flesh from the outside in. We know this because Anakin Skywalker experienced it directly, not as a comfortable metaphor, but as a literal catastrophe, his body left burning and ruined at the water's edge after his duel with Obi-Wan in 19 BBY, transformed from a living man into someone who would require machinery to continue breathing at all. The opposite extreme lies on Hoth, a world in the anode sector so thoroughly frozen that the nighttime temperatures do not merely drop below survivable. They become actively lethal to any unprotected organism within minutes. Hoth is a system planet, the sixth world orbiting its primary, and it is locked in an ice age so complete that no portion of its surface sustains liquid water or breathable open air without technological intermediation. Han Solo understood this intimately when he pressed a dying Luke Skywalker into the abdominal cavity of a slain Tauntaun, using the creature's residual body heat as the only barrier between Luke and instant freezing, a moment that captures something essential about Hoth's indifference. Survival, there is not a matter of adaptation or preparation, but of borrowing heat from creatures that belong to that world and desperately hoping it is enough. The native Wampas, massive carnivorous predators, evolved specifically for Hoth's conditions, embodied in their very physiology the question Hoth asks of outsiders. If you cannot generate and maintain your own heat in an environment where the atmosphere itself drains it from you, why should you survive? We move now from the extremes of heat and cold to the intermediate hostilities, and Geonosis offers us something different. A world where the air itself is thin and toxic, where the atmosphere is not breathable by human physiology, and where the heat is relentless without quite reaching the incandescent fury of Mustafar. Genosis is a desert world in the outer rim, rocky and barren, orbiting a red giant sun. Its landscape a maze of badlands and spire-like formations carved by wind and geological time. What makes Genosis lethal is not any single factor, but the combination of them. The atmosphere contains compounds that would corrode human lungs. The heat is sufficient to kill through exhaustion and dehydration over hours rather than minutes. And the aridity is absolute. There is no standing water, no moisture in the air itself to draw from, no way to sustain the basic biological processes that human bodies require. The Genosians, an insectoid species whose entire evolutionary history unfolded on this world, possess respiratory systems calibrated to an atmosphere that would kill us. They are built for heat and dryness the way we are built for temperate zones with breathable air. During the Clone Wars, when the Separatists converted Genosis into a droid foundry and the Republic's forces came to reclaim it, the humans who descended to that surface required environmental suits, and even then, the exertion of battle in such conditions would have been nearly unbearable. And we know from the historical record that the Empire, in its later paranoia, chose to exterminate the Genosian civilization entirely, not because of military necessity, but to erase the evidence of the Death Star's origins, leaving only scattered survivors like Click-Clack to carry the memory of a world that was perfect for its inhabitants and absolutely incompatible with everyone else. Now we move into the biological realm, the hazards that come not from simple chemistry, but from living systems evolved in alien directions. And Felucia teaches us something about what it means when a world's entire ecology has become an active threat. Felucia is a jungle planet in the Outer Rim, but it is not a jungle like those on Kashyyyk or Endor, where the forest is habitable by multiple species living in approximate balance. Felucia's environment is dominated by massive fungal growths, oversized plants, and a spore-laden atmosphere that saturates everything. The humidity is so extreme that the air itself becomes a medium for fungal reproduction. Every breath draws organisms into the lungs that the human immune system was never designed to resist. The fauna, rancors, and creatures evolved under the same fungal dominion are not merely large predators, but animals whose biology has integrated the world's toxicity into their own survival mechanisms. Jedi Master Arilla Secura fell on Felucia during Order 66, betrayed by her own clone troopers, and the planet itself seemed to conspire in her death. A world where every living thing, from the soil upward, is oriented against the survival of anything not born to it. And finally, we arrive at Dagobah, a world that is in many ways the inverse of Mustafar. Not a furnace, but a saturation. Not dry heat, but suffocating humidity. Not bare rock, but dense vegetation that grows and decays in an eternal cycle of rot and renewal. Dagobah is a swamp world in the Sluice sector, its surface a maze of murky water, bog, and fungal growth. Its air so thick with moisture that each breath is less inhalation than aspiration of water itself. The predators there, dragon snakes, swamp slugs, creatures evolved in the lightless depths of the wetlands, are perfectly adapted to stalking prey in that murk, but they are also utterly lethal to those whose biology developed under different conditions. What makes Dagobah peculiar, though, is that it is not lethal primarily through its chemistry or its temperature or even its predators, but through the accumulation of conditions. The cold at night, the oppressive heat during the day, the diseases that flourish in stagnant water, the visibility so limited that navigation itself becomes a form of combat. Yoda chose Dagobah as his refuge after Order 66, and he survived there. But Yoda was a Jedi Master of extraordinary power, and his survival was not a testament to Dagobah's habitability, but to his exception from the ordinary rules that govern human biology. When Luke Skywalker came to train there, he was constantly struggling, constantly reaching past the moment of his breaking, and the Force itself seemed present in Dagobah not as a comfort, but as an observer to his suffering. So what emerges from this examination is something that perhaps we should have seen clearly from the beginning. Habitability is not a binary state, but a spectrum determined by the alignment of a world's physical conditions with the biology of the species attempting to inhabit it. Naboo works for humans because millions of years of evolution on Earth, a planet with a similar atmosphere, similar temperatures, similar water cycles, shaped our bodies to fit exactly those parameters. Mustafar kills because it exceeds every boundary. Geonosis kills through chemistry. Felucia kills through biology. Dagobah kills through the sheer accumulation of incompatibilities. And the deepest lesson underneath all of it is this: a world does not need to be actively hostile to refuse us. It only needs to be indifferent to our survival, to have evolved in the complete absence of any evolutionary pressure that would favor our existence. Some worlds, in other words, simply were not made for us, and all the will and determination and technology in the galaxy cannot change that fundamental fact. Before we turn to the science of why certain worlds kill, I want to tell you about the people and machines who looked death in the face on those planets and somehow came back with breath still in their bodies. There is something to learn in survival that goes beyond the physics of atmosphere and temperature, something about will or adaptation, or what we are willing to become in order to live. Let me begin with a story that has lived with me since I first learned it. The night Luke Skywalker froze on Hoth, and the man who refused to let him die. After the iron cannon shot down the asteroid, Han Solo found himself separated from his squadron on the icy desert, pursued by Imperial walkers and snowtroopers across terrain so cold that exposed skin dies in moments. His Tauntaun, the bipedal mount beneath him, collapsed from exhaustion and the relentless cold, and Han was alone on a world that existed only to kill. He did not give in to Hoth's indifference. Instead, he cut open the beast's carcass and placed Luke inside the steaming cavity of its body, using the animal's residual warmth as a furnace until dawn broke and rescue could find them. It is a small act, or seems one, but I find myself thinking about what it means. That when a world becomes lethal, survival becomes not a matter of breathing, but of refusal. Refusal to accept the planet's answer, refusal to surrender your companion to the temperature. There is something almost primal in that, a human instinct older than starships or technology, older than the Empire itself. Then there is the story of Han Solo at Cloud City, which teaches us something different about survival. Bespin's floating city was built on the edge of habitability, its life zone breathable, but requiring constant engineering, constant attention, constant submission to the demands of a hostile world. Han walked into a trap there, and his survival took a form so strange that for a long time no one was certain he had survived at all. Vader ordered him frozen in carbonite, a process never attempted on a conscious human, a gamble that should have been death. The carbon freezing chamber filled with icy mist and magnetic fields, and Han Solo became a sculpture, alive somewhere beneath the frozen surface, preserved in a state between death and sleep, his heartbeat slowed to almost nothing, his thoughts gone dark. For months he remained that way, a trophy in Jabba the Hutt's palace, until Princess Leia and Lando returned to thaw him back into life. When he woke, he could not see, his eyes blinded temporarily by the shock of the carbon process, his body confused about whether it was alive or had been dead. There is something humbling in that. The realization that survival sometimes looks like ceasing to exist in any recognizable way, that you can outlast a world by becoming something other than yourself. Anakin Skywalker endured Mustafar in a way that demands its own weight of reflection. When Obi-Wan cut his limbs away and left him burning in the lava banks, Anakin did not die, though he came very close to understanding what death might feel like. Palpatine found him, a still-breathing horror of charred flesh and will, and brought him to a medical facility where machines and dark side power fused metal and flesh into the armor we know as Darth Vader. The life support suit kept him breathing on worlds that would have turned his lungs to poison, Mustafar most of all. And for decades he inhabited that boundary between life and machinery, his survival a kind of permanent negotiation between what he had been and what the suit allowed him to become. I have been thinking about what that means, what it costs to survive so absolutely that you must be remade. But survival is not only a human story. Some of the greatest endurances in the Star Wars saga belong to droids. R2-D2, a small astromech unit with a whistling vocabulary and a temperament that could only be described as obstinate, survived Anakin Skywalker's fighter throughout the Clone Wars. Fire, vacuum, combat that should have torn him apart. And he continued, his dome spinning, his sensors active, his determination somehow legible even through beeps and trills. When Anakin fell to darkness, R2 served Luke Skywalker, and he survived the frozen wastes of Hoth by refusing to stop moving, by trusting that where his master went, he would follow. He survived the deserts of Tatooine and the forests of Endor, the swamps of Dagobah and the throne room of the Emperor himself. There is something almost defiant about a droid's survival. They do not breathe, so airless worlds hold no terror for them. They do not bleed, so poison is meaningless. They are built to endure exactly what living things cannot. C-3PO, the protocol droid, crossed the desert of Tatooine on foot, his joints whining in the twin sunlight, his sensors screaming complaints about the sand and heat, and he survived not through any capacity for adaptation, but through sheer durability and the stubborn refusal of his circuits to cease functioning. Perhaps that is its own kind of courage. Then there are those who survived through the power of the Force itself. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who walked away from Mustafar's burning banks even as Anakin burned, even as everything he had believed in fell to ash around him. For 19 years he lived in the Jundland wastes, in a cave dwelling, sustained by discipline and meditation and the knowledge that somewhere on that harsh world, Luke Skywalker existed, a future that depended on his survival. The Force does not shield a Jedi from cold or thirst, not truly. What it does is allow you to accept those things, to move through them without resistance, to survive through surrender rather than struggle. That is a different form of endurance entirely. There is Qui-Gon Jinn, who descended into the core of Naboo with nothing but a portable rebreather, trusting the Force to guide him through waters that could crush and kill, through a darkness absolute enough to swallow hope. The rebreather was technology, fragile and finite, but what kept him moving through that abyss was faith. Faith in the Force, faith in his mission, faith that the right choice would be the one that led to survival. And there is Rey on Jakku, who survived not through Force mastery, but through ingenuity, through salvage, through the simple refusal to stop trying, even when the world offered her nothing but scarcity and servitude. She lived inside a downed AT-AT walker, surrounded by the wreckage of the Battle of Jakku, and she survived by understanding her world completely, where the water was, where the salvage was, how to move through the graveyard of starships without becoming another broken thing left behind. There is a kind of survival in that too, the survival of those with no power but their own hands and minds. What all of these stories share is something I want to sit with before we move forward. Survival on a lethal world is not a victory, exactly. It is an endurance, a negotiation, sometimes a transformation so complete that the person or droid who survives is not quite the same as the one who arrived. These are not tales of triumph, but of persistence in the face of indifference, the very human insistence that breath is worth continuing, that existence matters even when everything around you suggests otherwise. That is the foundation on which we will build our understanding of why some worlds permit life and others refuse it absolutely. The physics matters, yes, but so does this, the will of those who refuse to surrender to a planet's answer. That refusal is what we carry with us as we move into the final darkness of the lethal worlds themselves. Over the span of many thousands of years, the sapient species of the Star Wars galaxy have undertaken a quiet, largely invisible transformation, not through conquest or deliberate choice, but through the simple, relentless pressure of living where they were born. When you look at a Wookiee like Chewbacca, what you are seeing is not an accident of nature, but the result of something closer to a very long conversation between a species and a world. Kashyyyk demanded adaptation. The Rosha trees were safe, but reaching them required strength, climbing ability, coordination among groups, and the capacity for loyalty that would bind individuals together across lifetimes. Over millennia, Wookiees evolved to be tall, powerful, covered in thick fur to insulate against forest humidity and predators, and to live 100 years or more, long enough for a life debt made in youth to be honored in age, for bonds of kinship to deepen across generations. The thick fur that keeps them warm also makes them nearly useless on hot planets, which is part of why so many Wookiees, when pulled from Kashyyyk by slavery or war, find themselves lost in ways that have nothing to do with geography. There is a cost embedded in every adaptation, and Wookiees pay it every time they step onto a world warmer than their own. The Mon Calamari and the Quarren present a different kind of story, one of adaptation to the same world, diverging in opposite directions. Both species evolved on the ocean world Dak, or Mon Cala as it came to be called, but the Mon Calamari developed as amphibious beings with high-domed heads and webbed hands, equally comfortable in air and water, while the Quarren, squid heads to some, though never to their face, sank deeper, their tentacled faces and sleek bodies designed for pressure and darkness. For generations, the two species coexisted in floating cities and submerged domes, their tensions real but manageable, until the pressures of the Clone Wars and the Empire forced those tensions into violence and collaboration with occupiers. The adaptation served them well for millennia, but it also locked them into a world. Neither species could simply leave, because neither could thrive anywhere else the way they thrived in water. The shipbuilders of Mon Cala, including Admiral Akbar, built their mastery from this very limitation. They understood water so completely, the physics of moving through it, the balance between buoyancy and will, that they translated those understandings into the MC-80 cruisers that would carry the rebellion toward hope. Sometimes an adaptation that confines you to a world also gives you the tools to escape it. The Gungans of Naboo offer yet another model, beings shaped for water, but choosing or developing the technology to inhabit the air-filled bubble cities beneath the surface, creating Otoh Gunga and other settlements where water breathers could build civilizations in dry pockets. They did not evolve the ability to breathe air. They engineered their way out of that necessity, building hydrostatic bubble shields that let them live in the margins between two worlds. It is a strategy that requires not just biological adaptation, but knowledge, resources, maintenance. The city must be maintained, the shields must hold, or water rushes back in. On Kamino, the Kaminoans took this much further. Their world had been struck by ice ages so severe that its landmasses sank beneath the waves, and rather than abandon the world, they became beings of water itself. They grew tall and pale, with long necks suited for breathing air above the surface, even as they lived mostly on the water, developing the capacity to move between wave and sky with equal grace. From this radical transformation came their mastery of cloning, the deep understanding of life, genetics, and growth that made them the architects of the Grand Army of the Republic. There is something almost austere about it. The Kaminoans sacrificed the solid ground beneath their feet and gained, in return, the capacity to reshape life itself. The Jawas and Tusken Raiders of Tatooine represent perhaps the most visible cost of adaptation, not biological evolution, which takes millennia, but the immediate, deliberate reshaping of daily life to survive present conditions. The Tusken Raiders wrapped themselves entirely in cloth and bandages, retaining moisture against the twin suns' heat, their bodies becoming walking bundles of protection so complete that we scarcely know what they look like underneath. The Jawas, smaller, less physically powerful, wear hooded robes and retreat into their sandcrawlers, mobile metal fortresses that are both home and hunting ground, allowing them to follow salvage and trade across a world that would kill an unprepared being within hours. What they gave up, freedom of movement, visibility, the simple comfort of open skin, they sacrificed for breath itself. On Ryloth, the Twi'leks adapted to a world of extremes, tidally locked or with vast temperature zones that made equatorial regions lethally hot and polar regions impossibly frozen. They developed the Leku, head-tails that serve sensory and communicative functions, and learned to live in the twilight zones and cooler cave systems where survival was possible, building civilizations in the margins of habitability. This forced them to be miners, to know the stone, to retreat underground in ways that shaped their entire culture and made them vulnerable to those, like the Hutts, who could offer control of resources on the surface. The Hutts themselves, native to Nal Hutta, are beings shaped for swamps and thick humidity, their slug-like bodies and tough hides perfectly suited to polluted, moist environments that would sicken most other species. This is not incidental. The Hutts' dominion over criminal enterprises, their slow-moving patience, their hermaphroditic immortality, all of these flow partly from a species that is literally comfortable in conditions most others find repellent. They are not cruel because they are Hutts, but being Hutts, thriving where others merely survive, has given them certain advantages in understanding control. The Genosians present perhaps the starkest example of adaptation, creating complete incompatibility with those not similarly evolved. They are insects, essentially, with chitinous exoskeletons, rigid caste structures that emerge from their breeding, and the capacity, in some castes, to fly through air thin enough to kill an unprotected human in minutes. A Genosian breathes that thin desert air as easily as we breathe our own, their bodies sized and shaped for a world that is fundamentally hostile to our kind. But the cost of that adaptation is that they can never leave, not really, not safely. When the Empire sterilized Genosis to bury the secret of the Death Star, it did not merely kill a species. It demonstrated that adaptation, however perfect, offers no protection against the will of those with absolute power. There is a thread that runs through all of these examples, and it is this: every species in the galaxy that has thrived on a difficult world has paid for that triumph in ways that are invisible until the moment they try to leave. The Wookiee's strength confines them to cool forests. The Moan Calamari's grace in water makes air worlds struggle. The Kaminoan's mastery of genetics is purchased with the permanent loss of solid ground. The Jawa's robes protect them, but mark them as outsiders. The Twi'leks Leku are beautiful and functional, but make them visible, make them vulnerable to those who would mark them as different. We have spoken before about characters who survived the unsurvivable through will and technology and the Force, Han Solo and Anakin and Rey, and all the rest. But perhaps the deeper story, the quieter story, is about the billions of beings who did not survive unsurvivable things, and who adapted instead, slowly, generation by generation, becoming something slightly different, slightly more suited to their world, paying a price in flexibility and freedom for the gift of breath. And this is why, when we speak of a world's habitability, we must remember that the question is never simply, can I survive here? The question is, what must I become in order to do so, and am I willing to pay that cost? So here we are, at the end of our long walk through the galaxy, standing at the threshold of a practical choice. If you had to land on one of these worlds with minimal preparation, which could actually sustain you, and which would simply refuse? Let me be direct about this first. There are worlds that tip toward the survivable, and worlds that fall away into the lethal. And the line between them is not arbitrary. It is written into the chemistry of air and the behavior of water and the mercy or indifference of temperature. We have walked through Naboo's temperate graces, through Tatooine's harsh negotiation, through Kashyyyk's ancient forests, where species learn to live not against their world, but within it. We have seen how habitability is not a single factor, but a convergence. Breathable atmosphere, water you can access, temperatures your unaugmented body can endure, and a biosphere that permits coexistence rather than demanding your immediate death. If I were to rank the worlds we've explored, truly rank them, not with drama, but with the clarity of someone asking which ones would actually let you breathe, Naboo sits at the pinnacle. The capital, Theed, floats on an island in a tranquil caldera lake. The plains roll temperate and generous. The atmosphere is indistinguishable from Earth itself. You could land there with nothing but the clothes on your back, and while you would face difficulty, hunger, exposure to unfamiliar elements, the challenge of integration into existing societies, the planet itself would not kill you. It would give you time. After Naboo, the ranking becomes a series of concentric circles moving outward into difficulty. Dantooine, a grassy world with temperate plains and sparsely distributed settlements, would welcome you similarly, not as comfortably as Naboo, perhaps, but with the same fundamental mercy. You could survive there on your own effort alone. Yavin 4, the jungle moon orbiting Yavin Prime, sits in that same band. Breathable atmosphere, abundant vegetation and water, warm enough that shelter, while necessary, is achievable. The rebellion made their base in the ruins of the Masasi temples, precisely because the moon was hostile enough to deter Imperial patrol, but habitable enough to sustain human life without extreme technological dependency. If you landed there and knew how to work with vegetation and find fresh water, and if the wildlife did not consider you food, you could persist. Then comes the step down to worlds like Tatooine, Kashyyyk, and Endor, survivable, but only if you accept a fundamental bargain with the environment. Tatooine demands that you surrender the comfort of casual water access and the mildness of single suns. The heat is relentless, the air itself is dry, and water is currency precisely because the planet withholds it. But humans, moisture farmers, settlers in Mos Eisley and Mos Espa, the Jawas with their sandcrawlers, have persisted there for centuries. You could survive Tatooine, but you would be diminished by it, your life narrowed to the single focus of finding or creating water and shelter from twin suns. Kashyyyk, with its breathable atmosphere and tremendous biosphere, seems at first as generous as Naboo. But step down from the tree cities of Kachurho and Awalkroro into the Shadowlands, and the predators waiting there, the Katarn, the Kinrath, the creatures that evolved to hunt, teach you that habitability is not equally distributed across a world's surface. You could survive on Kashyyyk if you stayed in the high canopies, if you respected the Wookiees' hard-won knowledge of where it was safe to be. To descend is to court death. Endor, the forest moon where the Ewoks build their arboreal villages around Bright Tree, is perhaps the most deceptively habitable of all. It is temperate, lush, full of water and game. It is genuinely easier to survive there than on Tatooine. And yet it carries a hidden cost. The forest itself is magnificent and utterly indifferent to your survival. You would not die of suffocation or heat on Endor. You would die of hunger or predation or simple exposure to the elements, because the world does not care that you are struggling. All of these worlds, Naboo, Dantooine, Yavin 4, Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Endor share a quality. They would permit your survival if you were willing to adapt, to learn their rhythms, to accept the diminishment of comfort or the narrowing of possibility. They might not welcome you, but they would not actively refuse you the breath in your lungs. And then there is the gap. Across it lie the lethal worlds, and they are lethal in ways that preparation and determination cannot negotiate. Mustafar's lava lakes and volcanic heat do not merely kill, they obliterate. The mining colonies that operated there with heavy protective equipment were not comfortable settlements. They were extraction sites maintained by beings willing to accept near-certain death as the cost of profit. An unaugmented human landing on Mustafar without protection would last perhaps minutes. The air itself would cook your lungs. The heat from the ground would ignite your body from below. There is no bargain to strike with Mustafar. Genosis, with its thin atmosphere and aridity, kills through refusal rather than violence. The air is too sparse, too contaminated with compounds hostile to human respiration. The ground offers no water, and the Genosians, evolved perfectly for these conditions, tolerate no intrusion easily. During the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Padme faced execution in the Petranaki arena precisely because Geonosis was hostile to their survival at every level. They could not breathe comfortably, and the insects had no interest in permitting them to adapt. The world is not lethal through malice. It is lethal through simple incompatibility. Hoth, which we have touched on in passing, teaches cold as an absolute teacher. Temperatures so severe that exposure kills in hours, sometimes minutes. The Tauntauns that the rebellion used as mounts are native creatures. Their physiology permits them to thrive in conditions that would freeze human blood. To survive, Hoth required the rebellion to build Echo Base, a shelter, heated, provisioned, and even then, are being separated from that shelter, like Luke Skywalker fleeing from the Battle of Hoth, faced death within the span of a single night. Solo warmed him in a Tauntaun's body cavity, a measure born of desperation, and the acknowledgement that the planet itself offered nothing but killing cold. Korriban, Exegol, Crate. These worlds are lethal not primarily through simple environmental hostility, though that is present, but through a kind of spiritual or structural indifference. Korriban is a dead world, accumulated dark side energy poisoning the very ground. Exegol is buried so deep in caverns and shrouded in such storms that it supports only the machinery and will of those powerful enough to force survival from it. Crate is salt and crystalline mineral, poison to human metabolism, hostile in its very composition. So the ranking, in the end, is this. If you had to choose, land on Naboo. If Naboo is not possible, Dantooine or Yavin 4. If you need to survive somewhere harder, Tatooine will accept you if you accept its terms. Water scarcity heat, the slow narrowing of your life to the essential. Kashyyyk and Endor will permit you to live if you respect their danger and stay in the spaces where other species have learned to dwell. And if you find yourself on Mustafar, Geonosis, Hoth, Korriban, or Exegol, then the question is no longer which world you could survive on. The question is whether you have the technology, the power, the sheer will to force existence from ground that does not want you, and the answer, for most of us, would be no. The honest truth underneath all of this is that habitability is not a property of worlds alone. It is a relationship, a negotiation between what a world offers and what a being is willing to sacrifice to accept that offer. Naboo offers comfort and asks only that you build your life there. Tatooine offers breath and demands water as the price of every day. Mustafar offers nothing to humans and demands absolute transformation or death. And we, moving from world to world, must choose which bargains we are willing to strike, which costs we are willing to pay, which planets we will call home. That is the final choice. That is what all of this comes down to. We have spent this entire journey moving through the planets themselves, learning what makes them survivable, which ones offer shelter, and which ones refuse it, watching how species adapt and endure and sometimes transform completely to persist in hostile ground. But there is one final layer we must examine, and it is perhaps the most important one. We must understand how geography itself shapes the movements of empires, the strategies of wars, the fates of billions, and the course of galactic history. Because a planet's habitability is not merely a matter of atmosphere and water and temperature. It is, in the end, a question of power and access, and whether those who hold dominion permit you to survive. Let me take you back to the beginning of the Galactic Republic, to the time when hyperspace routes first began to be mapped, when the wealthy core worlds clung to their position of advantage through sheer proximity to the Galactic Senate on Coruscant. Coruscant itself is an ecumenopolis, a world so entirely covered in city that you cannot see the natural ground beneath. Millions of years of building upon building, spire upon spire, until the entire planet is one singular metropolis housing the government and the heart of power. To be close to Coruscant meant to be close to wealth, authority, and the protection of the Republic fleet. To be in the Outer Rim meant to be forgotten, exploited, or both. The Trade Federation understood this perfectly. when they imposed heavy taxation on trade routes passing through the Outer Rim worlds, particularly through Naboo. They were not merely seeking profit. They were asserting a fundamental truth. Control of the routes between worlds is control of survival itself. The blockade of Naboo was an act of geographic siege. By controlling access through hyperspace, they strangled the world's economy without firing a single shot. This is how geography shapes war, not through the terrain of battles alone, but through the territories between worlds, the routes that are open or closed, the worlds that are profitable or expendable. When the Clone Wars began at Geonosis, the strategic value of the planet was twofold. It held droid factories and separatist leadership. Yes, but more fundamentally, it sat at a crucial nexus of hyperspace routes in the Outer Rim. Whoever controlled Geonosis controlled access to entire sectors of space. The Separatists, led by Count Dooku and Supreme Leader General Grievous, knew this. They planted themselves there because the world's position and its productivity were inseparable. And when Yoda arrived with the clone army to break their hold, he was not merely liberating a planet. He was reasserting the Republic's authority over a crucial node in the galactic network. Yet Geonosis teaches us something deeper still about how worlds and wars entangle. The insectoid Geonosians, perfectly adapted to their thin-aired aridity, had built a civilization in harmony with their world. Under Archduke Poggle, they became collaborators in the separatist cause, manufacturing the battle droids that would kill across 100 worlds. Their world's habitability, its capacity to sustain a thriving insectoid civilization, became the very thing that enabled their destruction. After the Clone Wars ended, the Empire, seeking to bury the secret that Geonosis had been the birthplace of its Death Star plans, committed genocide. They sterilized the atmosphere, poisoned the water, and exterminated the Geonosian population in a calculated act of erasure. A world that had supported an entire species that had thrived for millennia was rendered functionally dead, not through accident or natural catastrophe, but through the deliberate will of those who wielded power. This is the terrible knowledge embedded in the full history. Habitability is fragile and entirely dependent on permission. Consider Kashyyyk, home to the Wookiees for generations beyond counting. The Roshar forests and the high canopies were not merely survivable, they were home, the ground of everything Wookiee civilization had built. Chewbacca belonged to that world. Tarful belonged to that world. The entire species had evolved and thrived there through centuries of unbroken connection. But when the Empire rose under Palpatine, an emperor with a documented hatred of Wookiees, the habitability of Kashyyyk transformed overnight. Suddenly, the very world that had sustained them became a site of extraction and enslavement. Hyperspace routes led there. It was accessible, exploitable. And so the Empire came and conscripted entire populations into labor across the galaxy, tearing beings from the only world that fit them. This is what we have circled around throughout this entire journey. A planet does not determine survival alone. Power does. And when power decides that a world's resources matter more than a world's inhabitants, even the most perfectly habitable planet becomes hostile. The Rebel Alliance, scattered and desperate, understood this principle intuitively. They could not control the core worlds. Coruscant belonged to the Empire, but they could move through Outer Rim territories where Imperial presence was thinner, where worlds were harder to defend because they mattered less to the center of power. Yavin 4, a jungle moon orbiting the gas giant Yavin Prime, was remote, difficult to approach, and surrounded by treacherous atmosphere and radiation that made hyperspace emergence dangerous. These liabilities made it valuable to the rebellion because the Empire would not prioritize defending it. The ancient Massassi temples, built by a long-dead civilization, provided shelter and structural protection. The moon's remoteness provided camouflage, and from there, the rebellion launched the assault on the first Death Star. Geography had not given them power, but it had given them a margin of safety. and that margin was enough. Then came Hoth, and with it, a different lesson. The Rebel Alliance established Echo Base on an icy planet in the Hoth system, a world so cold that Han Solo could shelter Luke Skywalker only by sheltering him inside the body cavity of a dead Tauntaun, letting the creature's dissipating warmth keep him alive through the night. This is what survival looks like on a lethal world. Not comfort or stability, but the refusal to be refused, the willingness to use the planet's own systems against it. But Hoth teaches us also that remoteness alone is not sufficient protection. The Empire's probe droids found the base. AT-AT walkers, towering machines of durasteel and weapons, marched across the ice. T-47 airspeeders, fragile and desperate, used harpoon cables to entangle walker legs and topple them. The Battle of Hoth was a triumph of strategy and ingenuity, but it was not a victory. The rebellion was forced to scatter, to abandon the base, to flee to other worlds, because geography protects only if you have time, and time was something they did not have. Mustafar lies in the Outer Rim, isolated, volcanic, utterly lethal, a world whose habitability is so compromised that even the Empire hesitated to hold it. Yet Darth Vader chose to build his castle there, chose to make his home in a world of fire and ash and rivers of lava that would kill any unprotected human within moments. He did so because Mustafar was far from the centers of power, because no one would willingly go there, because the very hostility of the world provided a privacy that even the Empire could not penetrate. This is geography as refuge for those powerful enough to survive it. By the time of the Resistance's struggle against the First Order, Crate, a remote mineral world with white salt covering red hostile soil, became a last stand precisely because it was forgotten, abandoned, one more barren world among countless others. And when Luke Skywalker's force projection confronted Kylo Ren on those salt flats, he was not fighting for the world itself. Crate had nothing to give, but for the time that the world's remoteness had bought, the margin it provided for the survivors to escape. This is how geography shapes the war then, not through dramatic terrain alone, but through the network of decisions about what matters, what is protected, what is sacrificed. Core worlds like Coruscant and Alderaan, beautiful, habitable, close to the center, are prized and fought over directly. Outer Rim worlds, difficult, remote, marginal, become sites of extraction, conscription, and refuge in turns. And the most lethal worlds, the ones that refuse habitability absolutely, become fortresses and tombs for those with the power to survive them. Mustafar, Korriban, Exegol. The history of the galaxy is not written in the stars alone. It is written in the roots between them, in the resources beneath surfaces, in which worlds the powerful choose to defend and which ones they choose to ignore. And every being who lives, survives, or dies in that history is shaped by whether their world has permission to sustain them, whether the geography they call home has been deemed valuable or expendable by those who wield dominion. That is the final truth, settled and still. Geography and power are inseparable, and habitability depends on both.